issues in a bipartisan way. With respect to infrastructure, I think it'd be fair to say that right now in Washington, D.C., it would be hard to get members of Congress to agree on the proper way to butter toast. But I think everybody understands the importance of upgrading infrastructure. That's because it is widely understood you cannot have big league economic growth in America with little league infrastructure. The sorry state of our infrastructure right now is a danger to individuals. For example, you can't cross the Mississippi River on a bridge that's cracked in half. It's also a recipe for national decline if the United States continues to fall behind China and other countries on broadband, on roads, on highways, on ports, on rail, airports, housing, and in other vital areas. Obviously, and this is why we're holding the hearing, the tough questions with respect to infrastructure is how you go about paying for it. In my judgment, there is an obvious answer if you say that it is essential to pay for infrastructure in a fair way. It is long past time for mega corporations to pay a fair share for building and repairing roads and bridges. They drive trucks across America's roads and highways. They send products to market through our airports and our waterways. They rely on our power grids and communication systems. And it seems to me to be just basic fairness that they ought to pitch in for the infrastructure that makes our country an economic superpower. Now, the hard evidence shows that the mega corporations, and this is based on the fact that the finance Democratic staff's been out crunching the numbers, we've found that mega corporations have never contributed less to federal revenues in modern American history than they're doing now. Data from the Independent Congressional Budget Office shows that in the aftermath of the Trump tax law, corporate income tax revenue is down nearly 40% from the 21st century average. Many of the mega corporations, the largest corporations, are paying nothing. That's it, zero. News reports out just this week say that mega corporations flush with cash are also gearing up for a new round of stock buybacks that overwhelmingly benefits the wealthy shareholders. It's not any kind of cash crunch that's kept major corporations from pitching in here. Asking the largest of the mega corporations in America to pitch in a fair share is not going to sacrifice America's ability to compete in tough global markets. Competitive does not mean that the biggest corporations should pay zero tax. Paying for infrastructure and creating high-wage, high-skilled jobs are not mutually exclusive. Now, there's lots of talk about how it's got to be user fees that pay for infrastructure. I will say the suggestion is somehow middle-class workers are supposed to pay what mega corporations will not. Middle-class budgets are already very hard-pressed, and if you don't think Americans keep track of the cost of driving, you haven't been watching the TV news much of the last week. The fact is the infrastructure bill has been growing for decades due to Congress's negligence and the failure of mega corporations to pitch in fairly. And when you say it's going to be fair, it means allowing someone like myself, honored to represent Oregon in the Senate, telling a rancher in Eastern Oregon or a home health aide on the coast that they're not going to carry the whole burden. They're not going to make up the shortfall. Working people driving long distances are willing to pay their fair share. They tell that to us in our community meetings. I just came off 13 of them in Oregon. They've been doing so every time they pull up to the pump. What they don't want to do is support immunizing mega corporations from paying anything at all. Prior to 2017, there was bipartisan interest in bringing back cash trapped overseas as the best way to fund a major infrastructure bill. A number of us on a bipartisan basis said that to then President Trump. Study after study showed that corporations had trillions of dollars parked around the world. Senators had repatriation bills ready to go. There was bipartisan interest in that idea on the Senate Finance Committee. In 2017, however, Donald Trump and Republicans went a different direction and plowed that cash into even bigger corporate tax goodies as part of the Trump tax law. That was a major lost opportunity, and the infrastructure tab has only grown in the years since then. So now, first and foremost, we ought to be looking at smart financing tools to help draw private dollars off the sidelines and into infrastructure. It worked a decade ago with Build America bonds. And just in the interest of brevity, let me tell colleagues, when I proposed for the first time these Build America bonds, it was completely bipartisan. Senator Wicker was a leading co-sponsor of it. Senator Thune was a leading co-sponsor. Senator Collins was a leading co-sponsor. Senator Klobuchar was deeply involved. And in the Finance Committee, last night of the Recovery Act, I was asked what might happen. I said, let me lowball it. It's only going to last a year and a half. Government had never bonded before. I said, we might sell $3 to $5 billion worth of Build America bonds. America, in a year and a half, sold $182 billion worth of Build America bonds, an example of a public-private partnership coming together. This is an approach the Congress has to return to because it works. I want to thank our witnesses for joining the committee. What we're going to do now is we're going to hear from Senator Crapo. We understand how urgent this is. That's why the committee is having this hearing, why Senator Crapo and I thought it was so important to air all the options. We'll hear from Senator Crapo, then we'll have Senator Shaheen do an introduction, and Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this timely hearing on funding and financing options for our nation's infrastructure. Infrastructure investment has traditionally been bipartisan and accomplished through regular order. I'm encouraged by the productive meeting that I had last week with President Biden and some of my Republican colleagues in the Senate about the need to modernize and expand our transportation system and broadband in a bipartisan manner. The framework Republican senators discussed with President Biden included roads and bridges, transit, rail, airports, drinking water and wastewater, and port and inland waterways, as well as water storage and broadband infrastructure. Consideration of offsetting the cost of infrastructure with a corporate tax rate increase or increases in international taxes, especially coming out of the largest negative shock to the economy on record, is counterproductive and a non-starter on my side of the aisle. With the FAST Act extension expiring at the end of September, reauthorization of our surface transportation programs should be the basis of any infrastructure conversations. As our witnesses will discuss, Congress must provide long-term stability and certainty for these programs so that transportation agencies, cities, counties, and states across the country can make responsible long-term transportation planning decisions. For the last few transportation authorizations, Congress has made the decision to spend more than the receipts going into the Highway Trust Fund. In order to advance a comprehensive, long-term reauthorization bill, it's important that we do so in a fiscally responsible manner. There is no silver bullet for how to pay for transportation infrastructure, but historically it has been paid for by user fees, which makes sense. For many years, the users of transportation infrastructure paid fees for that use through the gas and diesel taxes, which were deposited into the Highway Trust Fund, and then distributed to pay for our nation's road and bridges and transit system. There have been many changes to the transportation landscape since Congress last raised the gas tax in 1993, such as increased fuel efficiency and a significant increase in electric vehicles, or EVs, on the road. With this evolution, Congress needs to ensure that all users of the transportation infrastructure are paying into the Highway Trust Fund. To make up the projected $195 billion 10-year shortfall of the Highway Trust Fund, Congress needs to think creatively of ways to ensure that EVs are paying their fair share. If we are able to identify a top-line spending number and go through a bipartisan FAST Act reauthorization process, I'm ready to work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to do the hard work of addressing the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. With that, the United States will have the funding we need to maintain and modernize our transportation system to meet the rapidly evolving landscape of today and in the future. To maximize use of taxpayer dollars, we should consider proposals to attract private capital for infrastructure projects, repurpose unused federal funds, and improve and expand upon existing infrastructure loan programs. I agree with the comments that our chairman just made about the Build America bonds. They can be a significant way of incentivizing private capital into our infrastructure. We should consider how public-private partnerships can fit into our comprehensive infrastructure funding and our financing. The Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or TIFIA as we call it, the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Act, and the Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act are good examples of financing tools that can leverage federal resources, and we should consider ways those programs should be improved and expanded. Private activity bonds for transportation projects have proven so attractive that the program is oversubscribed. And with the $15 billion cap having been met and additional applications outstanding, we should address it. We need to consider how PABs and other bond programs can be used to help states and localities improve and move their infrastructure projects forward. There are hundreds of billions of dollars in unspent funds from COVID relief packages. Those funds should be put to work and repurposed to fund infrastructure projects. Mr. Chairman, the word infrastructure itself has become somewhat of a fluid term lately. As this hearing demonstrates, there's bipartisan support for finding long-term funding and financing solutions for transportation infrastructure, as well as increasing access to broadband connections, particularly in rural America. Americans rely heavily upon broadband technology for business, government, education, and personal activities. Efforts have been underway for some time to address a digital divide in broadband deployment between rural and urban or suburban areas, to ensure communities, regardless of size, can access technological advancements. The pandemic magnified the importance of expansive and reliable broadband technology, as so many Americans found themselves working and learning from home. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing. Let's get to work in a bipartisan way to maintain, modernize, and expand America's infrastructure. I thank our witnesses today for their willingness to participate in this hearing.
Thank you very much, Senator Crapo. And I would just like to note for our colleagues, we're only 19 minutes into this morning's hearing, and we have already had an outbreak of major bipartisanship around Build America bonds. And I want to thank Senator Crapo for his thoughtfulness. Now, I also want to render an apology to Senator Hassan, because Senator Hassan, so that the record is clear, is now going to introduce one of her thoughtful guests, who is Ms. Shaheen. So, you New Hampshireites all stick together, apparently, even with respect to your names. Senator Hassan, we welcome you. Please make the introductory comments you desire.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Wyden. Thank you for being such an effective chair of our committee, and Ranking Member Crapo. Thank you as well for your work and for holding today's hearing on how we can invest in American infrastructure. And I would like to welcome a Granite Stater who is an expert on this topic to today's hearing. And she is Victoria Sheehan from Nashua, New Hampshire, and has served as the Commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Transportation since 2015. I have seen firsthand her commitment to providing safe and efficient transportation systems throughout our state. When I was governor, I appointed Commissioner Sheehan and partnered with her to move forward a number of infrastructure improvement projects. Commissioner Sheehan has since been reappointed to her post by Governor Sununu. Commissioner Sheehan has also taken her expertise to the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, where she currently serves as president. And she is only the second woman in the association's history to serve in this role. An engineer by training, Commissioner Sheehan has extensive experience in transportation management, and she will bring an important perspective to today's hearing. Commissioner, thank you for being here today and for all of your work to help keep Granite Staters safe and keep our economy moving. I'm looking forward to hearing from you today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
First witness will be Dr. Joseph Kyle, Director of Microeconomic Analysis at the Congressional Budget Office. As we all heard, Senator Hassan has sought to have Ms. Victoria Sheehan, who's president of the American Association of State Highway Officials and commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Transportation, here. We're glad that Senator Hassan has arranged for Ms. Sheehan to be here. Our third witness will be Ms. Heather Buck, subcommittee chair for the National Association of Counties Transportation Steering Committee. She's a county commissioner for Lane County, Oregon. I know Ms. Buck well. Nobody works harder. She gives public service a good name every single day, and we're so glad that she's here from Lane County. And our final witness will be Ms. Shirley Bloomfield, Chief Executive Officer of the Rural Broadband Association. We'll make your formal remarks a part of the hearing record in their entirety. And why don't we begin first with Dr. Joseph Kyle of CBO.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden, and good morning to you and to Ranking Member Crapo. Thank you very much for inviting me to today's hearing. I'm going to touch briefly on 3 points this morning. First, the status of the Highway Trust Fund. Second, options to generate revenue for the trust fund. And third, options for subsidizing increased borrowing by state and local governments. For more than a decade, the government has been spending more each year from the Highway Trust Fund than the revenues collected for it. Those revenues come mostly from taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel, as well as various taxes on heavy trucks. CBO estimates that the balances in both the highway and the transit account will be exhausted in the first half of the coming fiscal year. The total shortfall over the next 10 years is projected to be $195 billion in CBO's baseline estimates. If the trust fund's balances were to be exhausted, the federal government would not be able to make payments to states on a timely basis. As a result, states would face challenges in planning for transportation projects because of uncertainty about the amount or timing of payments from the Treasury. Turning to options for generating revenue, one approach would be to require users of the highway system to bear more of those costs. When people drive, they impose costs they do not fully pay for, and those include wear and tear on bridges and roads, delays from traffic congestion, and the harmful effects of exhaust emissions. A combination of taxes on fuel and mileage that made users pay for more of those costs would make use of the system more efficient. If you wanted to increase revenues by charging users of the system, you'd have various options. One option would be to increase existing taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel. Those taxes have been unchanged since 1993. Increasing them by 15 cents a gallon and indexing them for inflation would raise about $26 billion in revenue for the trust fund in the first year, and that amount would gradually increase over time. Another option would be to impose new taxes on users of the system. For instance, the government could impose a tax on vehicle miles traveled. Some states already have VMT taxes on commercial trucks, and CBO found that each 1 cent per mile of federal tax would raise $2.6 billion per year if it was levied on all commercial trucks and all roads. Still, another option would be to impose an annual tax or fee on owners of electric vehicles. Currently, EVs comprise only a small share of vehicles on the road, and such a tax would raise about $0.2 billion per year initially. It's important to note that implementing a new tax would require resolving several practical steps to assess and collect the tax, and implementing new taxes would probably cost more for the government than increasing existing ones. Some approaches would raise concerns about privacy, especially if applied to personal vehicles. An alternative to imposing the cost of increased spending on users would be to distribute them more broadly. Since 2008, the federal government has transferred over $150 billion from the general fund of the Treasury to the Highway Trust Fund. You could adopt that approach again. And compared with some options, such as increasing the gas tax, funding highways through broad-based taxes would have the advantage of imposing a smaller burden on low-income households as a share of their income. As an alternative to increasing funding for highways or other infrastructure, the federal government could increase subsidies that reduce the cost of borrowing by state and local governments. The federal government subsidizes about $20 billion of such borrowing for highways each year, most of that through tax-exempt bonds. Of course, such financing is not a new source of revenue, but a way of making future state and local revenue available to pay for projects sooner. I'll briefly mention two options for subsidizing borrowing. The federal government could authorize tax credit bonds, which would allow lenders to take a credit against their taxes owed rather than deducting interest earnings from their income. The cost to the federal government of such bonds would depend on the credit subsidy, and that's a decision that you would be faced in making such authorizations. The federal government could also increase the cap on private activity bonds for highways. QPABs that have been issued account for about 90% of the $15 billion total allowed for that purpose under current law. The cost to the federal government of such bonds is similar to municipal bonds, but they can be used for a broader range of purposes. So I'll stop there, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Mr. Kyle. We'll next hear from Ms. Shaheen.
Well, good morning, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today and speak to the critical need to provide stable and predictable funding for the federal transportation program, as well as financing tools that state and local governments can utilize. Thank you also, Senator Hassan, for your words of welcome. My name is Victoria Sheehan, and I serve as the Commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Transportation and as President of AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. It is my honor to testify on behalf of the Granite State and AASHTO, which represents the State Departments of Transportation for all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. First, allow me to express on behalf of all the state DOTs our gratitude for the leadership of this committee on several important issues. These include the repeal of the $7.6 billion rescission of Highway Contract Authority in 2019, the extension of the Surface Transportation Program through fiscal year 2021 while shoring up the Highway Trust Fund, as well as the $10 billion in COVID-19 relief provided last December. We also thank you for your firm commitment to getting the federal surface transportation bill done on time, as well as possibly providing infrastructure funding as part of an economic stimulus and recovery package. This morning, I would like to begin by discussing why timely reauthorization of the federal surface transportation program is so important. New Hampshire, as a small rural state, relies heavily on federal funds to make infrastructure improvements. Any delay, or even worse, a series of short-term extensions would wreak havoc across the country and would impact not just state DOTs, but our partners, such as local governments and the construction industry. Projects of all types and sizes would be at risk, including roadway safety improvements, state of good repair work, as well as capacity improvements and active transportation investments. AASHTO members know only too well that a timely reauthorization relies on securing the funding to pay for these programs. We stand ready to work with this committee and others in Congress to find a solution that addresses the growing infrastructure investment needs across the country. Since 2008, Congress has had to transfer over $150 billion from the general fund of the Treasury to the Highway Trust Fund in order to maintain funding levels. While AASHTO is very grateful that Congress and this committee were unwilling to reduce surface transportation investments, we recognize that general fund transfers do not provide the long-term solution needed to stabilize these important programs. In order to simply maintain the current Highway Trust Fund spending levels, adjusted for inflation after the current extension of the FAST Act, it is estimated that Congress will need to identify $74.8 billion in additional revenue for a 5-year bill through 2026. While at the same time, the purchasing power of the Highway Trust Fund revenues has declined substantially, losing over half of their value in the last 28 years. To stretch the value of the dollars we are provided, the state DOTs continue to support a role for federal financing tools that allow needed projects to be advanced sooner. I want to recognize the work of you, Mr. Chairman, and others on this committee to develop and pursue additional financing tools to help meet transportation needs. As an example, in 2014, the New Hampshire legislature approved a 4.2-cent increase in the state gas tax, primarily intended to complete the reconstruction of Interstate 93 from the Massachusetts state line to Manchester, the largest city in New Hampshire. However, at the same time, New Hampshire DOT pursued a Transportation Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, or TIFIA loan, backed by that state gas tax increase. The TIFIA loan was structured so that New Hampshire is paying interest only for the first 10 years of the 20-year loan, allowing us to pledge the additional new revenue to rural paving and bridge work. The result was the completion of a regionally significant project, savings of over $20 million in financing, as well as improved pavement and bridge condition across New Hampshire due to our ability to pave 1,400 additional lane miles of roadway and replace 23 structurally deficient bridges. Financing tools can play an important and specific role, and many states already rely on various forms of financing, ranging from traditional tax-exempt bonds, tax credit bonds, state infrastructure banks, and private equity, among other financing options. But lastly, I want to say that state DOTs are extremely encouraged that both Congress and the Biden administration are discussing potential infrastructure investment. An infrastructure package coupled with a robustly funded surface transportation bill provides a unique window of opportunity to make much-needed investment in our nation's transportation systems. Whichever revenue tools are utilized to fund these programs, AASHTO looks forward to assisting you and the rest of your Senate colleagues in finding and implementing a viable set of revenue solutions. Thank you again for the honor of being here today and the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Shaheen, and we very much appreciate your representing the Association of State Highway Officials. Our next witness will be Heather Buck. And I'm always explaining, Ms. Buck, the fact that folks from Oregon are up early for these sessions. You had your cornflakes at the crack of dawn. So thank you for all the good work that you do for Lane County. And let's have your testimony, please.
Thank you, Chair Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Heather Buck. I serve as a county commissioner for Lane County, Oregon. I'm also representing the National Association of Counties. Owning and operating 44% of public roads and 38% of the national bridge inventory, more than any other level of government, America's 3,069 counties, parishes, and boroughs are the leaders in the nation's transportation infrastructure network. We also directly support 78% of public transit systems and 34% of public airports that keep Americans connected in every corner of our country. I'm here today to underscore the significance of the county role in transportation and infrastructure, and to discuss how we can best work together to meet the challenges of today and the demands of the future. I'd like to begin with a point on which I believe we all agree. Our nation's infrastructure is in need of investment, and now is the time to act. Counties appreciate the continued bipartisanship around infrastructure and urge Congress to seize this exceptional moment to deliver historic investments that will enhance the quality of life for Americans across the country and help improve our global competitiveness from the bottom up. A snapshot of infrastructure backlogs that includes $17.3 billion just for local bridges located off our nation's highways and $19.4 billion of deferred maintenance on U.S. federal lands reveals the great and immediate need for investment. The chair and ranking member know well the considerable role federal forest revenues play in supporting roads and bridges across the western United States. We urge final passage of Senate Bill 435, reauthorizing the Secure Rural Schools program for 2 years. While counties play a significant role in the national network, we understand that improving our nation's infrastructure relies on a strong federal, state, local partnership. Annually, counties invest $134 billion in the maintenance and operation of public works and construction infrastructure. This includes essential community institutions such as schools, hospitals, jails, courthouses, parks, broadband deployment, and water and sewage systems. In fact, local governments are the main funders of infrastructure. In 2015, we spent $1.6 trillion directly on infrastructure, more than both our state and federal partners. We're doing our part at the local level. However, 45 states, including Oregon, limit the ability of counties to raise local revenues in various ways, making the intergovernmental partnership vital to meeting our public sector responsibilities. Given our unique position to support America's infrastructure, counties call on our federal partners to implement additional financing tools and dedicated funding streams that will allow us to continue to provide excellent public service. Municipal bonds and other federal financing tools are key resources for county infrastructure projects. We appreciate the works of this membership in this committee to reintroduce the American Infrastructure Bond Act. To build on that progress, American counties offer the following recommendations. Continue to protect the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds. These bonds remain the primary method used by states and local governments to fund public infrastructure projects. Any changes to their tax-exempt status would drive up costs for both counties and taxpayers. Restore the tax exemption for advanced refunding bonds. This would lower borrowing costs, optimize our stewardship of taxpayer resources, and drastically improve the ability of state and local governments to invest in critical projects. Fully restore the state and local tax deduction. The SALT deduction is an essential aspect of preserving our nation's system of federalism. Repealing the cap ensures that when counties make these local decisions to deliver our essential public services, our citizens are not double taxed. Provide a permanent fix for the Highway Trust Fund. To plan and execute small and large-scale transportation projects that are critical to moving countless amounts of people and goods across our nation, a permanent fix that will return long-term solvency to the fund is needed. Direct federal funds to locally owned infrastructure. Counties firmly believe that increased or expanded financial opportunities can't come in lieu of dedicated federal funding streams for locally owned and operated transportation. As a form of government closest to the people, counties know how to put federal dollars to work where they're needed the most. Counties appreciate your attention and stand ready to work with you. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Buck, and again for participating so early. Just so the record's clear, our committee created the Secure Rural Schools program, and Senator Crapo and I both are very supportive, so we'll be working with all of you in the counties in a bipartisan way. Our final witness will be Ms. Shirley Bloomfield, Chief Executive Officer of the Rural Broadband Association.
Good morning, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you about funding and financing infrastructure, particularly how it relates to broadband. I'm Shirley Bloomfield, the CEO of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. We represent about 850 community-based providers who are providing high-speed broadband and other advanced services across the most sparsely populated parts of our country. The rural broadband industry and our nation as a whole have a great story of success to date in delivering these services, and that's certainly been never more important than it has been over the past 15 months. But we still have so much work to do in both deploying as well as operating networks. We still have far too many Americans that are lacking connectivity. And this is where public policy can play a really important role in helping to build and sustain broadband in rural markets that are otherwise not able to justify these kinds of investments. The high cost of providing service into rural areas is an imposing obstacle, and you have to deploy, and you have to maintain, and you have to make it affordable. So there's other barriers as well that come into play. We've got supply chain concerns that are very time consuming and expensive permitting issues. So as this committee and as Congress consider plans to bridge the current digital divide, I'd like to offer some specific recommendations with respect to broadband infrastructure and how it might be considered. First, we should be building networks that are built to last. Given the user demands that have grown exponentially over time, a smart infrastructure plan should aim for the best return on long-term investments that will meet the future needs of consumers and keep pace with the bandwidth-intensive applications that Americans desire. Putting resources towards infrastructure that must be substantially rebuilt in just a few years, frankly, is a waste, and it'll leave rural Americans behind. Second, we have to coordinate the many broadband programs that are out there and direct funding for new networks to unserved areas to limit overbuilding of existing federal network investment and make sure that any new broadband program actually coordinates with existing broadband programs that we have at the FCC, at USDA, NTIA, and numerous state programs. Additionally, rather than just creating new programs from scratch, we've got some existing programs such as the High Cost Universal Service Fund that have a real proven track record of success and promoting accountability. And they should also be looked to receive additional support to be able to build on their success in extending and sustaining broadband. Third, it can't be lost that networks must be maintained after they are built. Congress should consider funding for this purpose, which will keep rates affordable for consumers. Distance and density make it very difficult, if not impossible, to justify a business case for infrastructure investment to start. No provider, whether you are a cooperative, a commercial entity, regardless of your size, can deliver high-speed, high-capacity broadband to rural America without the ability to justify and then recover the initial ongoing costs of sustaining that infrastructure investment in these high-cost areas. If there is insufficient support in the first place to enable the business case for ongoing operation of affordable broadband in rural areas, initiatives like tax incentives alone simply may do little to move that needle. You don't need tax relief in an area where you're already not making money. Fourth, we need really clear standards for providers looking to leverage federal resources to meet the real-world needs of consumers. And we should avoid using rural America as a test lab to see if technologies work or whether they don't. Those receiving support should be required to show that they clearly can meet the program standards and then use those resources to deliver better, more affordable broadband that will satisfy consumer demand over the life of the network in question. Otherwise, consumers are the losers here. Fifth, we must encourage policymakers to look local when it comes to identifying broadband solutions in rural America and to leverage the expertise and the experience of smaller community-based providers, regardless of their corporate form, in overcoming these challenges. I look at our members. NTCA service providers are based in their communities. They have deep, long-standing relationships with their local governments and their anchor institutions, and the best results can often be achieved when operators with significant experience in building networks and delivering communication services work together with their stakeholders in the community to identify and respond to their specific needs. Finally, barriers to broadband deployment must be addressed to sustain. We've got to be looking at things like how do we minimize some of these barriers, environmental reviews, federal lands, historical obligations, and also looking at supply chain issues. And I can't stress this enough, but at a time when our nation's supply chain is so stretched thin, providers are hearing longer and longer times for deliveries of supplies to actually build these networks. There's so many opportunities for this committee to weigh in and to ensure that we are able to shore up that supply chain. In conclusion, my sincere appreciation for the ability to come testify, share some thoughts about how critical broadband is to all Americans, regardless of where you live, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bloomfield. We've got many senators going to testify, so we're going to try and stick to the 5-minute rule. Let me note that Senator Crapo and I already announced our support for the renewable effort of Build America bonds. What I can tell colleagues is we've got 5 current senators who were original sponsors of the Build America bonds effort, and now both Senator Crapo and I would like to see it included in the effort to fund infrastructure. So what I want to start is getting into the principles of this user fee issue, because to me, when you think about infrastructure, Congress has to contemplate the cost of the use and the amount of money on the table. So Dr. Kyle, you've been looking at these issues. If Congress imposed a $100 per year fee on electric vehicle owners, would it make a meaningful dent in the highway trust fund's shortfall, in CBO's opinion?
So, Senator, currently, electric vehicles account for about 1% or so of the vehicle fleet on the road, and about 2% of sales. So, if a $100 fee or tax were to be imposed, that would raise about $200 million, $0.2 billion per year in the first years. That's about 1.6% of the shortfall in the coming years. That would probably change over time as electric vehicles became more prevalent on the road. But in the near term, that would only have a small effect on the shortfall.
All right. Now, driving a mile in a four-door electric sedan obviously doesn't do the same harm to the highways as driving a mile in a fully loaded 18-wheeler. And the state highway officials and the Department of Transportation has shown that harm done to our nation's roads by heavy trucks is essentially much more than that done by passenger vehicles. There have actually been some estimates that a heavy truck does nearly 10,000 times more damage than an electric sedan. So, Dr. Kyle, the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation have examined options for additional truck taxes, including a 5-cent per mile mileage tax. Can you give us a sense of what the potential revenue would be that would be raised in this kind of approach, according to the work done by the Congressional Budget Office?
Of course. So we recently did an assessment of the possibility of vehicle miles traveled taxes on commercial trucks. In looking at that, we did note, as you just noted, that heavy trucks cause much more pavement damage than passenger vehicles. Passenger vehicles contribute significantly to congestion in rural areas, or I'm sorry, in urban areas. But in terms of pavement damage, it's mostly heavy trucks. So we looked at the possibility of a BMT tax and how much revenue that would raise, and found that each 1 cent of the tax would raise about $2.6 billion. So a 5-cent tax would raise $13 billion per year. In thinking about that, it's important to understand that that new institutions will need to be put in place to collect that, and those aren't there in place yet.
I appreciate the answers, Dr. Kyle. For colleagues, the math here is pretty clear from CBO. CBO says that a reasonable truck VMT could raise $8 to $12 billion per year. And if you had a $100 per year fee on electric vehicle owners, CBO says that would raise roughly $200 million per year. So that's the math, and we're obviously going to have a debate about lots of issues, but that's what CBO has told us on the math. Now, Ms. Buck, we're so glad you're here to give us a sense of your on-the-ground perspective, and I think you heard us talk about the ability of local governments to use Build America bonds, and it's something that's been used all across Oregon and bridges, and Lane County had a great interest in that. Oregon issued nearly $1 billion worth of Build America bonds for roads and bridges and schools. If paired with robust federal funding, is that the kind of financing tool that would be helpful to Lane County in accelerating the financing of your infrastructure needs?
In Lane County, as you mentioned, we were able to utilize the Build Back Better bonds for significant upgrades to our community college and a large bridge construction project. Today, our county has new infrastructure challenges that could be similarly met with such a federal tool and a combination of financing. We have ideas of being able to ensure that we capture the greenhouse gases at our landfill and be able to potentially sell those back to our public transit district. You know, counties will use every tool in the toolbox that we're able to see, and we support any effort on that behalf.
Thank you for your good work and for being up early to educate the Senate on what things are like on the ground. I'm over my time. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And my first question is for you, Ms. Sheehan. I was very interested and impressed with what New Hampshire has done. In your testimony, you highlighted that the New Hampshire Department of Transportation has used federal loans, and I think you were referring to TIFIA loans, that you were giving the example on, to help finance infrastructure projects in the state. Could you just go over again the reasons you utilized that approach and what the ultimate leverage you received and benefits you received from doing that?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. We're very proud of the work that we were able to accomplish with the TIFIA loan in New Hampshire. In 2014, as I mentioned in my opening testimony, the New Hampshire legislature approved a state gas tax increase. We actually refer to it as the road toll in New Hampshire to infer that it is a user fee. And the intent was to complete primarily one project, the widening of I-93 from Salem to Manchester, New Hampshire. With the TIFIA loan, we were able to stretch the value of that gas tax increase. The way the loan was structured, we pledged the revenue to rural bridge and paving work in addition to the completion of 93. And that's because in the first 10 years, we're paying interest only. So we're able to take all that additional revenue and invest it across the state. We also qualified for the rural rate. So the loan interest rate was 1.09%. So there was also significant savings in terms of the financing costs as compared to traditional bonding.
Well, thank you. So, and could you just clarify to me what kind of leverage you got? In other words, what I'm trying to get at is for the amount of money that you were able to put up in terms of the loan, how much in addition to that were you able to leverage it into? You indicated the number of existing of additional projects, but what was that in dollars roughly, or in a ratio of dollars?
So we were able to reconstruct 1,400 miles of roadway and approximately 23 structure deficient bridges. So that was a significant cost avoidance for the state because we were able to invest in the near term as opposed to having to continue to band-aid that infrastructure. So directly there was a savings of approximately 40 million in terms of the ability to advance things sooner. And then, as I mentioned, the financing savings provided further value.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Kyle, in the testimony and discussion so far, we've heard a lot of discussion about, I think I'd call it increasing access to private capital for infrastructure. We've heard discussion of tax credit bonds, private activity bonds, Build America bonds, infrastructure banks, and so forth. Each of those could be, and we have other funds. We have TIFIA, we have WIFIA, we have the RRIF and other funds or programs. And they focus on things like roads and bridges and rail and water infrastructure. Could you tell me, maybe just discuss some of these different approaches to accessing private capital? Are they effectively able to be utilized to leverage spending, as has been shown in the case of New Hampshire? And do you have any kind of data on how effective that might be? What kind of revenue we might expect from certain federal investments into these types of bonding programs?
Sure, I'll be happy to do that, and I'll use TIFIA as an example. Over a recent 5-year period, I think there were 19 programs that used TIFIA funding, and with TIFIA, the federal government makes direct loans to an organization that is undertaking a transportation infrastructure project. That entity needs to either get private financing or borrowing through private activity bonds that are also complement the federal money in that. So I think TIFIA loans accounted for about a quarter of the financing in those 19 projects that I mentioned earlier.
Well, maybe the return's the wrong word, but a 3-to-1 leverage in terms of the money that is put in versus the money that is getting applied or incentivized to be applied to infrastructure.
Right. In those examples, about a quarter of the funding would have come from the TIFIA loan program. Some of the funding comes from private activity bonds, which are also tax favored bonds.
All right. And very quickly, do we have anything like that working for broadband right now?
I am not aware of any such programs that are specifically on broadband. Perhaps one of the other colleagues on the panel knows more about that than I do.
I'm out of time, but Ms. Bloomfield, maybe I'll give you that question afterward for you to respond in writing. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Senator Stabenow's next.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. First, I want to just briefly comment on proposals that some colleagues are making about federal fee for EVs to fund the Highway Trust Fund. I sincerely wish we had enough electric vehicles on the roads today to make this a big issue. And in fact, EVs are about 2% of vehicles sold today. We hope it'll be more down the road. But as Mr. Kyle made clear, a fee on EVs right now would be equivalent to what people pay in gas tax. Would fill about 1.6% of the Highway Trust Fund revenue shortfall over the next 5 years. So I support going down the road, that we should explore a range of options to fund the Highway Trust Fund, including something on electric vehicles at some point where it's actually an issue, but it's certainly not a solution for funding in the next 5 years at least. But in that context, I would agree with Chairman Wyden that our first priority for funding should be to make sure large corporate users of our roads and highways are paying their fair share. And I can assure you that people in Michigan don't think paying zero is fair. And so that's where I hope we'll focus. I'd like to turn to Ms. Buck for a question. Prior to 2017, as you've indicated, state and local governments had access to a financing option called advance refunding for municipal bonds used to fund a whole range of infrastructure projects. And the details of advanced refunding are complicated, as you know, but the bottom line is that it allowed communities to finance infrastructure projects at the lowest cost. So, Ms. Buck, in your testimony, you noted that the Government Finance Officers Association found that in the decade prior to repeal, there were over 12,000 advance refundings, saving communities over $18 billion. And I know this has been supported by Michigan's state treasurer as well, urging that this tool be put back in the toolbox. So that's why Senator Wicker and I teamed up, as you know, to introduce the Local Infrastructure Act, which will reinstate advance refunding. We have over 20 bipartisan co-sponsors. I really hope this is going to be put in the next infrastructure bill. But I wonder if you could just speak more to the kinds of projects that municipal bonds are used to finance, and explain why you think restoring the advance refunding would be, quote, one of the most effective actions to provide state and local governments.
Chair Wyden, Senator, thank you so much for the question. We have a variety of bonds. We are a medium-sized county, and we have used them over the years for a variety of needs. We would be interested in knowing what's available and what we can do on our level for bonding. It's really important for us when we're speaking about utilizing one of these bonding tools that we are able to pay them back within the 20, 30, 40-year time in which they would be out. And they're at rates that are low enough, and we know that we could be able to refinance them should rates change. It's really important. For example, we tried recently to go out for a bonding with our taxpayers for a county courthouse to the tune of about $250 million. The state was going to pay for half of that. But it did not pass, and we need to be able to show or partner in the future, if we go out again, that this has economic development and stimulus associated with it. I think the pairing of those two would make it more enticing to our taxpayers.
Thank you very much. Let me turn now to talk about broadband for a second. I think we all agree now that that certainly is what anyone would call infrastructure. And as chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, I've been laser focused working with colleagues to really deliver on robust investments to deal with the digital divide. And certainly that became extremely apparent during COVID. Ms. Bloomfield, in your testimony, you mentioned that federal funds to address gaps in high-speed internet access must be done in a manner that's sustainable, which is important given the federal government's role, because we have 3 different agencies involved, as you know, in broadband deployment. So in the 2018 Farm Bill, we authorized a number of USDA programs to scale up broadband in rural America, but we also added requirements for coordination with USDA, FCC, NTIA to improve the targeting. So what would you recommend as we build out these efforts, building on what we did in the Farm Bill and in other efforts to ensure that that effective partnership really exists?
So thank you, Senator. And first of all, let me applaud the leadership you all showed on the Ag Committee. The work that you did creating the Reconnect program has really meant dollars in the ground. People are getting broadband for the first time thanks to that program. So I would say a couple of things. First, use the same metrics, use the same maps. Right now, Congress recently passed legislation and then funded legislation recently to actually complete a national mapping program. The FCC is hard at work. Let's make sure we use the same map so we can stay coordinated on all of that. RUS and the FCC have a long history of staying coordinated with each other, long-standing relationship. USDA really funds the capital of these broadband networks in these rural markets. The FCC has really supported the ongoing operations and affordability. But I think there's some work that could be done to make sure that at the operational level, those folks are talking, as we talk about grants, how do we make sure that grants are not going into overlapping jurisdictions? So again, applaud the initiative. It is critically important, and I think we've got some great work ahead thanks to your leadership.
I would disagree with a thing Senator Stabenow said or Ms. Bloomfield said. We're just going to have to move on. So let's go next to Senator Grassley.
Well, we'll go on from where, thank you, Senator. We're going to go on from where Senator Stabenow left off because I'm interested in infrastructure. So before I ask my questions, I'd just note that the infrastructure has always been an area where Congress has worked in a bipartisan way. We have always proved that this Senate can move such bills with the passage of the water infrastructure bill. Within the last couple of weeks, Republicans and Democrats are not far apart on the infrastructure related items. I'm encouraged that bipartisan talks continue with the president. As former chairman and ranking member of this committee, I understand that it's hard to find consensus on how to pay for infrastructure. But Mr. Chairman, we have met that challenge before, and I think we're going to do it again this time. I appreciate all the witnesses participating today. So my first question is, if we have learned anything over the past year on the pandemic, it's the vital importance of broadband and being able to stay connected for our businesses, health, education, well-being. The state of Iowa estimates that it will require over $800 million in new investment to make affordable high-speed broadband available to all Iowans. These are the hardest to connect, mainly rural farms and homes. In recent testimony before the Commerce Committee, several witnesses, including former FCC Commissioner O'Reilly, stated that to meet the unmet needs of those who are truly unserved, we need laser focus on concentrating on those without service and should meet that goal before expanding the focus to those who already have some service. I know that there is concern that if we were to expand this focus, it would divert money and attention from those without service. So obviously my question is to you, Ms. Bloomfield. Do you agree that we need the laser focus on connecting those unserved? And if you want to expand in any way on this issue, I would appreciate it. Could you continue to explain how coordination of federal programs can be improved, as well as my first question?
Absolutely, Senator. So you have the distinction of having the most community-based broadband providers in the country in the state of Iowa. So I could not agree with you more that we've got to be laser focused on those Americans that are still waiting for connectivity. And again, if we haven't learned anything over the past year, then shame on us. Those folks need connectivity. And when we think about prioritizing, absolutely, the prioritization has to be to those who are still waiting for that connectivity. That is where the first tranche of dollars should go. Then there are a number, networks are living, breathing entities. They need to be upgraded. They need to be maintained. That's when we can then pivot to thinking about how do we continue to improve all of the networks that already exist. For example, the ones that are provided by your 100 independent carriers out in the state of Iowa. That is why mapping is going to be so important, because we don't really know the full story of where those unserved or underserved Americans are. So I think that's one thing. The other point that I would make to your comments is we have a once in a generation opportunity on the investment side, on infrastructure, to do this right, to aim higher, to do better. So when we talk about connecting those unconnected Americans, we shouldn't be putting in infrastructure that in 2-3 years, we're going to be back to you talking about how we fund upgrading that infrastructure. We've learned so much about how Americans use broadband over the course of the last year. We need to make sure that we are looking at symmetrical services, 100 over 100, the ability for folks to upload as fast as they are downloading. We are seeing that in application. We are seeing demand for broadband bandwidth go up by about 25% a year. That is only going to explode, and that is going to create innovation, and that's going to help the American economy. So there's a lot of different places that we need to be looking, but you are absolutely right. Let's get those folks who are not on the networks, let's get them connected, and then let's focus forward.
I yield, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Next is the Chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Carper.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for holding this hearing today. I want to thank you and Senator Crapo for doing that. I want to thank each of our witnesses, Dr. Kyle Machian, nice to see you again. You were just before committee 2 months ago, as I recall. Heather Buck and Shirley Bloomfield. A lot of you heard, I'm not a huge hockey fan, but I have a lot of respect for Wayne Gretzky, who's maybe the greatest hockey player ever played. And he was asked in his prime, he said, why are you such a good hockey player, Mr. Gretzky? And he said, I go where the puck will be, not where the puck is. That's what he said. I go where the puck will be, not where the puck is. A couple of weeks ago, we had a hearing in our Committee on Environment and Public Works, and we had a hearing on vehicle miles traveled, a notion which really, I think, has its roots in Oregon, as the chairman knows, and the road user charge. And we had witnesses from around the country who came and talked about whether or not that is where the puck will be, and if that's where we need to be pointed. Senator Stabenow, if she's still on the line, knows what is going on in the auto industry in terms of moving off of gas and diesel-powered vehicles onto electric and onto hydrogen. It's been a very slow uptick until of late. 20 years ago, colleagues, I went out and bought a Chrysler Town and Country minivan with my son, Christopher. It has today 550,000 miles on it. He and I went out about 2 months ago when he was home from California, went out about 2 months ago and drove cars again. And we drove all electric vehicles. And the electric vehicles, the Chevrolet Volt was the car of the year about 10 years ago. It got 38 miles on a charge. We drove all kinds of vehicles just a month or two ago. They get over 300 miles on a charge. And I ordered one just 2 days ago that gets 326 miles on a charge. But we're going to see just an incredible uptick. People love to drive these vehicles. They're fun, they're fast, and they don't send any pollution into the air. The upkeep is low. That is where we are going. And it's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to happen with increased velocity going forward. When I was new in the Senate, I sat right in front of a guy named Ted Kennedy, whom my colleagues remember well. And I remember having lunch with him when I was new in the Senate, and I asked him, I said, why do all these Republicans want you, Ted Kennedy, big Democrat, liberal Democrat, why do they want you to co-sponsor their big bills? And he said, I'm always willing to compromise on policy, never willing to compromise on principle. That's what he said. Always willing to compromise on policy, never willing to compromise on principle. Chairman's already mentioned principles. Some of you have mentioned principles. I can just ask our witnesses. I'm going to say a principle that I think that we can agree on. I just want our witness to say just really yes or no. One of the principles would be that we need to make substantial investments in infrastructure, and particularly in transportation infrastructure. Is there anybody among our witness panel who would say no? Speak now or forever hold your peace. I don't hear anybody. Okay, and another principle would be things that are worth having are worth paying for. Is there anybody among our witnesses who would disagree with that? Say no. Hearing nothing, forever hold your peace. Another one would be those who use our roads, highways, bridges have some obligation to help pay for them. Is there anyone who would say no to that? All right. How about, and here's another, our witness from the counties. Sometimes we think that the responsible, whether it's transportation or it's water, which we work on a lot earlier this month, whether the federal government, it should all be on the federal government. I think maybe a principle should be this is a shared responsibility. We heard that from our NACO folks just this morning. Is there anybody who thinks that this should not be a shared responsibility? Okay. And I like to say there are no silver bullets when it comes to funding surface transportation. There are a lot of silver BBs, and some are bigger than others. I was interested to find out. George Voinovich and I teamed up during the Bowles-Simpson days, more than a decade ago, and we suggested to restore the purchasing power of the gas and diesel tax. I'll be honest, friends. I think where we're going as a country in the next dozen or so years, I think we're moving to something akin to VMT. It's not going to be the only thing, but it's something that makes a lot of sense. What we need to do is create a bridge to the future. A bridge to the future. I'm going to ask each of our witnesses to take a minute apiece and say, what should that bridge to the future be? Very, very crisply and succinctly, starting with Dr. Kyle. Thank you, Dr. Kyle. Very crisply and say, what should the bridge to the future be?
So, Senator, I hate to not give you a direct answer to that question, but my job is to give you options and help you evaluate them.
On the record, for the record, please. Thank you. Michigan, good to see you again. Again, the bridge. We're looking for a bridge to help build bridges, but the bridge to the future.
So in 2019, the AASHTO Board of Directors took up a resolution concerning both the future sustainability of the Highway Trust Fund, as well as what some of the near-term solutions might be. And we really narrowed in on 4 options: motor fuel tax increase or indexing, freight-based user fees, per barrel oil fees, as well as continuing to advance a mileage-based user fee solution or a vehicle miles travel fee.
But thanks so much. Ms. Buck, just the bridge to the future, what would that bridge include?
Returning solvency to the fund by increasing federal fuel taxes, implementing vehicle miles traveled program, and other alternatives would provide sustainable revenue, and that is imperative for our nation's highway and transit systems.
Thank you, ma'am. Finally, Ms. Bloomfield, what would the bridge look like, the bridge to the future?
The bridge to the future.
Or maybe a VMT system. Go ahead.
It's going to be a digital bridge. It's the 21st century superhighway is broadband connectivity. We found that when we couldn't go to our offices, we couldn't go to our schools, the ability to stay connected, do commerce, do education, do telemedicine, all through digital. So I'm gonna give you the digital bridge.
All right. Thank you, Senator Carper, Chairman Carper.
Thanks very much.
Senator Cornyn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Crapo, for having a hearing on the absolutely taboo subject of paying for infrastructure. It's a conversation we've needed to have for a while. And for myself, let me just say that a repeal or of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is a non-starter, as is the a general tax increase on the American people and in the gas tax. So we need in my view, something a little different. And then I'll have a suggestion or at least an idea that we can explore. But Dr. Kyle, the Department of Transportation has not conducted a national cost allocation study in almost 2 decades. So we don't actually have a clear picture of how much wear and tear is being done to our highways or who is doing most of that damage. As someone who's clearly an expert in good budgeting, does it concern you that we're sitting here trying to figure out how much to pay for infrastructure without actually knowing how much it should cost or who should be chipping in to cover the maintenance of our roads and bridges?
It does create challenges, Senator. Obviously, the most recent cost allocation study is about 20 years old, and if that were to be updated, I think that would be quite helpful to everyone.
Ms. Sheehan, excuse me, I apologize. The witnesses today have spoken at length about fixing the Highway Trust Fund, and I'm all in for that. While not likely feasible in this context, and I don't want to take that off the table, but can you speak to the potential benefits and challenges of eliminating various revenue generators like the tire tax, the heavy vehicle use tax, and others, and replacing it with a single cost-adjusted user fee like miles traveled?
So as we transition to any new solution, the cost of collection is something that we want to look at closely. And until we know more about the solutions that are being proposed and are able to adequately estimate what those costs are, it's challenging for us as state transportation officials to have an opinion on whether one solution is more advantageous than another. But we at AASHTO stand ready to continue to support this committee and Congress as you look at all the alternatives so we can understand what the cost implications might be of implementing a new solution.
Dr. Kyle, in 2019, the Joint Tax Committee provided a score for a vehicle miles traveled user fee on class 7 and 8 trucks. These are the heaviest commercial trucks, with some exemptions for farm, state, and local government trucks. They assumed a rate of about 25 cents a mile, and it generated on average about $33 billion a year. The total they projected from 2019 to 2024 was $101.3 billion. Just as an idea that the committee ought to consider, do you see that as a viable means if the policy was accepted of raising the money that now is we need that is missing in the Highway Trust Fund?
So a VMT tax does have the potential to raise significant revenue, as in the example that you cited. The challenge would be that the types of mechanisms for collecting and enforcing the tax aren't yet in place, and those would need to be developed. And the cost of doing so could be substantial.
Yes, I'm sure the administration of that would be a challenge, any sort of new approach. But right now we've got a big hole in the Highway Trust Fund. We got to come up with some money from somewhere. And I would just propose respectfully, we call this what it has always been under the Highway Trust Fund, which is a user fee tied to the gas tax. But as I indicated earlier, I don't believe there's any political support for an increase in the gas tax across the board. I think I've heard President Biden say that, and I know that that's true on our side of the aisle as well. But a targeted vehicle miles traveled user fee on heavy trucks used in commercial vehicles, along with perhaps some relief on other fees and that the trucking industry pays, to me seems like one idea that while there's no perfect idea, and there's also nothing free, we need to come up with something that makes sense. And so that's something I appreciate the committee considering, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn, and we'll be working in a bipartisan way on these issues. Thank you. Senator Brown is next. He's chairman of the Housing and Banking Committee, which has significant transportation responsibilities as well. Senator Brown.
Thank you. And amazingly enough, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask about that. So thank you. And thanks for the comments of my colleagues. And I really appreciate your holding this hearing. We know there's an enormous need for infrastructure investment everywhere in this country. And in my state, especially, the neighborhoods and towns and homes have been overlooked by Washington and by Wall Street for too long. I worked with Chairman Wyden and Senator Whitehouse and my Republican colleague, Senator Portman, to introduce the Bridge Investment Act to provide competitive grants for bridge replacement. The Brent Spence Bridge over the Ohio River between Cincinnati and northern Kentucky carries 3% of our nation's GDP across it. But that bridge is dangerously outdated. We secured more than $3 billion for bridge repair in the highway package, developed by now Chairman Carper and Senator Barrasso last Congress and their committee, but that barely scratches the surface, as we know. So the federal share of replacing bridge spends alone is likely more than $1 billion. Each of our states has thousands of small bridges owned by cities and counties that need repair. So my question to this book is this: as the chairman said, I chair the Banking and Housing Committee, has jurisdiction over public transit issues too. Talk to me what can Congress do to make possible housing and transit investments working together? And as you answer, talk about the benefit to workers and to families as we do that.
Chair Wyden, Senator Sherrod Brown, thank you so much for the question. At the county level, there are a variety of things that we have determined that could help the investments in housing while paired with transportation. There is several ideas, one of which is to pursue transit-oriented development housing partnerships with agencies and support the FTA joint development projects. This prioritizes the development of underutilized and surplus properties across transit corridors. In addition, there's a partnership outreach to local financial institutions. This outreach could support widespread development of ADU construction loan projects, appraisal pilot programs, and construction of loan programs for home conversions and additional housing units. And also there's the pursuit of community land trust and limited equity cooperative models in rural lands. This strengthens and facilitates rural affordable housing via the community land trust model and LEC hybrid model.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I had a conversation with the chair about, with Chairman Wyden over the weekend, a pretty lengthy conversation about the tax gap. We know the Trump appointed IRS commissioner estimates that the tax gap is as large as $1 trillion. Senator Thune and Senator Whitehouse in their subcommittee last week discussed that. People know that the difference between taxes owed and taxes paid, when it's that large, it isn't fair. Constituents in Portland and Eugene, Oregon, or Columbus or Cleveland, Ohio know if you punch a clock in a factory or wait tables or help the elderly in a nursing home, you have to pay the taxes you owe. That's why, as I heard Senator Cornyn talk about revenue, this is a place to start when it comes to financing these priorities. We've discussed it. It's not about raising taxes. It's about collecting taxes already owed by taxpayers who aren't paying what they owe. So I'm hopeful my colleagues on both sides of the aisle can agree that closing this tax gap, ensuring corporations and the wealthy pay what they already owe, that's a good place to start when it comes to funding these infrastructure priorities. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the last minute of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown, and thank you very much for the helpful input as well over the weekend. It was really useful. Senator Thune is next. John, you're muted.
You got me? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today as this committee begins working toward a reauthorization of surface transportation programs. This committee plays a crucial role in funding any reauthorization of these programs, and it must be done in a bipartisan manner that recognizes our nation's diverse and highly interconnected transportation system. For example, it's crucial that transportation policy and investment continue to recognize the importance of rural areas where the vast majority of agricultural and industrial commodities originate. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but those investments benefit the entire country, not just rural areas, by keeping the national transportation system fluid and interconnected. And while they may not be located in major cities or experience high traffic volumes, rural freight corridors are a critical component of the nation's transportation system, ensuring that goods are transported around the nation and the world safely and efficiently. Their circumstances also mean that revenue solutions which might work in an urban area, such as tolling, are simply unworkable in rural areas. Finally, it's crucial that we work together in this committee on long-term funding for the Highway Trust Fund, which is long overdue and sorely needed. And I want to thank our witnesses again for being here to talk about that subject. Ms. Sheehan, as you all know, the Highway Trust Fund will face a $190 billion cumulative shortfall by 2030. Continued transfers from the general fund, which pass this burden on to our grandkids, are not a long-term solution to solvency. Could you describe why the uncertainty associated with highway trust fund revenues has a negative effect on infrastructure investments at the state level? And then if you could try and answer this together, then we'll try and get to a second question to another panelist. But you listed several options for providing additional highway trust fund receipts. Under current circumstances and as the nation recovers from the pandemic, which do you see as the most viable?
So thank you for the question, and thank you for the attention to need to invest in rural infrastructure. It's extremely important that state DOTs in particular have certainty around future federal funding. Any shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund that jeopardizes our ability to deliver on the projects and programs that we are committing to would be extremely disruptive to the communities that we serve. It also causes challenges for the construction community as they prepare to bid and advance the work that we are advertising. And so it is very important that we look at the long-term funding solutions for the Highway Trust Fund. As I mentioned, the AASHTO Board of Directors in 2019 coalesced around 4 specific revenue mechanisms. The first would be a motor fuel tax increase with indexing. Alternatively, you could look at a freight-based user fee, a per barrel oil fee, and many of our state DOTs have been active participants in the Surface Transportation System Funding Alternatives Program, soliciting through that grant program funding to advance mileage-based user fee or vehicle mile travel fee concepts. So we have a lot of experience now in this area and look forward to working with the committee.
Which of those do you think makes the most sense based on where we are today?
We believe that we need to look at a national pilot before we'd be ready to move towards a mileage-based user fee or a VMT model. So we would favor some of the other solutions, perhaps the short-term solution.
Ms. Bloomfield, the American Rescue Plan tasked the Department of Treasury to help close the digital divide, but without coordination with expert agencies like the FCC and NTIA, we risk wasting these funds and overbuilding existing broadband networks. Could you talk about the need for proper coordination to ensure that this funding goes to the areas that are truly unserved?
Absolutely. So first of all, you know, given your leadership role in the broadband space and how much work you have done, I think we have just started to see some of the rules come out from Treasury. I am very heartened by the fact that they are really taking a very forward-looking perspective on it. They're, explicitly allowing funding to be used for broadband, looking at making sure we look at a target of 100 over 100 symmetrical speeds that will bring the most robust broadband out to parts of the country. And not unlike your commentary about transportation, the fact that the more Americans that are connected digitally as well, the more valuable it is for everybody across the country. So again, I think the threshold of looking at areas that are lacking 25.3 being the basis for being unserved is really critical. How do we get those folks connected and then build onto that with those that have networks that need to be maintained, and to make sure that we can make broadband affordable for all. That's another key component of all of this. But transportation and broadband have a lot of similarities I'm discovering this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Expired.
Thank you, Senator Thune. Next is Senator Bennett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Senator Crapo for your comments about Build America bonds. That gives me some hope going forward. And I wanted to start with Ms. Bush. Last month, my colleague, Senator Wicker, and I reintroduced our Bipartisan American Infrastructure Bonds Act. The bill would create a new class of direct pay taxable bonds to help state and local governments finance critical public projects. These bonds would be similar to Build America bonds created in the Recovery Act, but would improve on those because, among other things, they'd be exempt from sequester or automatic budget cuts. American infrastructure bonds would be attractive to investors who do not benefit from traditional tax-exempt bonds, such as pension funds and institutional investors. So, Ms. Bush, if states and local governments had access to this additional tool of direct pay bonds, what effect would you expect it to have on public infrastructure growth and development? Could it potentially save them money as compared to relying solely on tax-exempt bonds?
Chair Wyden, Senator Bennett, thank you. Expanding access to taxable bond market will incentivize and boost investment in local communities. The COVID-19 pandemic has compounded the existing strain on the nation's infrastructure systems and widened our digital divide. Thank you to Senator Bennett and Wicker for introducing this bill, and it will greatly improve our ability to invest in the critical infrastructure projects and improve the resiliency of our many county-owned infrastructure assets. We believe that the direct pay bonds like Build America bonds are excellent complement to municipal bonds for county infrastructure projects, especially now as we continue to battle the dangerous effects of COVID-19 on county budgets. And we welcome the extra assurances that direct pay bonds provide.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Ms. Bloomfield, 2 months ago, I wrote to the Biden administration along with Senators King, Portman, and Manchin, urging the administration to bring our federal broadband standards into the 21st century. Today, the FCC defines high-speed broadband as a download speed of 25 megabits per second and an upload speed of 3 megabits per second. The standard at the U.S. Department of Agriculture is even slower. If you're a parent working remotely with kids going to school online, there's nothing high-speed about that. And as a country, we've got to stop spending billions of dollars on networks, as you said, that are outdated as soon as they're finished. That hurts rural communities the most, marooning them with broadband speeds that people living in a city or suburb would never accept. The federal government would say that the job has been done. We need to invest in future-proof networks across the country that will meet our needs, not only today, but for years to come. And I'm sure you've heard people in Washington talk about how high-speed broadband can't work in rural communities, and that even if it did, people don't need those speeds. That hasn't been our experience in Colorado, and I know your members disapprove that view every single day. Can you tell us more about how your members are investing in affordable, future-proof networks in rural America?
Absolutely. And thank you, Senator, for your leadership on weighing in about how important it is that we do this right. We have this opportunity. We look at 100 over 100 as the build-out minimum speed for any federal funding, because again, the speed, anything less is going to be obsolete immediately, and federal dollars would be wasted. And I think we have this chance to do this in a way that also brings comparability to your point. We are seeing providers constructing networks in urban areas that are capable of 100 over 100. Why shouldn't rural America have the same access to that connectivity? We certainly don't want to make sure that we've got, one set of citizens that are second class, particularly when we see that one of the biggest hurdles for rural Americans is the geography handicap. We've been able to bridge that with broadband. Again, watching folks, the number of telemedicine clinics that got set up, as an example, over the course of the pandemic, amazing. The use of telemedicine, 40% increase. We will never put that genie back in the bottle, nor should we. The ability to really unleash innovation and invention, and much less the fact that we've got to have our kids doing homework at the counter while we're on our VPN for work. So again, I think we are short-sighted as a country if we make less of an investment.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Bennett. And I'm glad that you and Senator Wicker are looking at a variety of different bond options. I remember Senator Wicker was one of our original sponsors back when we proposed Build America bonds, and the federal government had never bonded before. We've come a long way, and we'll be working very closely with you and Senator Wicker, and I know Senator Crapo is going to want to work in a bipartisan way on this as well. Senator Casey is next.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much, and I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today on so many of these critical issues. I'll start with what I think is an assertion that both parties agree with, and that's that if we fail to invest in our infrastructure, we're paying a cost. That failure to invest provides or results in costs for the nation. And I would, in my judgment, our failure to invest in infrastructure is not a problem of recent vintage. We have failed to invest in our infrastructure for about a quarter of a century. Once in a while, we've made investments in transportation infrastructure, but in broad-based investments we haven't made. In our state of Pennsylvania, the most recent estimate is about 15% of our bridges are in the structurally deficient category. So that means thousands of bridges in our state need substantial repairs. And I think that's one of the reasons we're all wrestling with these issues about what are the needs and what are the investments we got to make, and how do we pay for them. I come from a state, though, that has a substantial rural population. We have 67 counties, but 48 of the 67 are considered rural. In some parts of counties, that means that you have a lot of agriculture, obviously, but also rural can often mean a small town. Rural can often mean communities that are left behind when it comes to investments in infrastructure. One of the ways that I'm looking at this infrastructure challenge is through the context of not just bridges in the big cities or in the larger population communities, but so-called off-system bridges. The bridge that takes that ambulance over a bridge to make sure that someone can be provided medical care. The bridge in that small town that takes that school bus full of children from their homes to the school that they go to. And these off-system bridges, as Commissioner Buck has noted, have not been the subject of nearly enough attention. I'm not putting words in her mouth, they're my words. So Commissioner, I want to start with you on these off-system bridges. In our state, it's about 47% of bridges in my home state are off-system bridges. You told us there's about a little more than $17 billion in backlog in maintaining these bridges. Can you tell us what happens to a community when a bridge is not maintained, these so-called off-system bridges?
Chair Wyden, Senator Casey, thank you so much. I also live in a district that's largely rural here in Oregon, and those bridges are lifelines to metro centers where supplies are needed. When we're considering emergency preparedness in our community, those bridges are absolutely essential. With natural disasters coming more frequent, more often, and more powerful, it's so critical that we make sure that those roads and bridges are in good repair so that emergency services can come when they're needed. They are also a way in which communities can easily get cut off from the rest of the nation, both from just physical travel, but also when lines of communication are down, internet, phone lines, and such. So it is imperative that those bridges are maintained on a very regular basis with ongoing funding where there aren't fits and starts.
I appreciate that. And I think one of the challenges we have is to make sure that we have local input when we're making these determinations about infrastructure. And I'd ask you this, Commissioner, how can the federal government better include local leaders in deciding how best to spend federal resources?
Counties firmly believe that at the local level is where we make the best decisions on the best use of those funds. It's so important to be able to receive those direct payments so that we can make those critical decisions on behalf of our residents.
Commissioner, thank you. I want to thank you and the other witnesses, especially you and Ms. Bloomfield, for focusing on these rural communities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Senator Portman.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your fitting me in. I think this is an incredibly important hearing because probably the most important aspect of infrastructure that we're not talking enough about is how do you pay for it? I think there's a general consensus on the need for more funding for our roads and bridges and a broad definition of infrastructure, including broadband and certainly water infrastructure and electrical grids and so on. But But how you pay for it's a tough thing. And I'm going to mention three things here quickly. One is to use some of the COVID money that's already been appropriated but not obligated. Another would be these public-private partnerships, the so-called P3s. Another would be infrastructure banks, building on TIFIA and so on. Let me start, if I could, with a question to you, Commissioner Shaheen, with regard to transportation projects under the COVID-19 legislation. $350 billion is supposed to go out under the new American Rescue Plan. I think only about 50 or 65 billion of that has gone out so far. My state of Ohio wants to use some of this for infrastructure. Are you finding that's true with regard to other states?
Thank you for that question. And yes, we are hearing the same thing here in New Hampshire and across the country. During the pandemic, many of our governors were forced to implement the stay-at-home orders. And as a result, we saw less travel on our transportation network. And that meant there was a significant reduction in revenue at the state level. Many of our states also support municipal transportation investment. And here in New Hampshire, 12% of the revenue that we collect goes to cities and towns. And so we would very much anticipate the American Rescue Plan dollars being used to both advance projects that have been put on hold because of revenue uncertainty, as well as to increase the investment.
So under the current law, it can be used for broadband and water infrastructure, but not for those roads and bridges you're talking about. So would that be helpful to be able to use that funding? And is there a way we can get credit for that? In other words, as we're asking about, how do we pay for new infrastructure, roads and bridges? Wouldn't this be a good example of how we could take some already appropriated funds and attach them to new infrastructure spending by changing the law?
So here in New Hampshire, we're closely examining the guidance that came from U.S. Treasury in terms of the allowable uses of the American Rescue Plan dollars. But yes, our goal is always to stretch the value of the federal funds that are provided to state DOTs and look at all the different financing and funding options to make sure that we can maximize the opportunity.
In New Hampshire, would you use the federal money if you had to do more than a 20% match? Normally it's a 20-80 match, most of the grant programs. What if it was a 30-70 match? Would you still be interested in using the infrastructure, the money for infrastructure?
So here in New Hampshire, it's a little bit different for us. We primarily use toll credits to match our federal program, but certainly we'd be looking at opportunities to access discretionary grants, perhaps with additional relief dollars. The more flexibility we have, the more opportunities to extend the value and compete as well for additional discretionary opportunities.
Yeah. Well, I would tell you, in some states like Ohio, there's a strong interest in this, and it sounds like New Hampshire is in the same situation. And I hope we can use some of this funding as a way to help provide some of the gap we'll have in terms of funding. The other is the P3s, and I guess Commissioner, you're probably a good person to ask about this too, but also our representative, Commissioner Book from the National Association of Counties. What can we do on the federal level to incentivize the use of P3s? Right now, as I understand it, this value for money analysis, sort of like a cost benefit analysis, is used to evaluate whether traditional public financing works better or a P3 structure, a private public partnership structure. And states are not required to use this analysis for every project in the transportation improvement plan. Should we be encouraging their use to try to drive the use of P3s more for project financing? Would that help pay for infrastructure?
So certainly, state DOTs, we've been embracing the concepts of asset and performance management. So we're looking at the cost-benefit analysis around different investment strategies. And certainly, P3s are a powerful tool, and those opportunities to partner with the private sector to increase the investment in transportation are extremely attractive.
Yeah. How about the National Association of Counties? Quick answer to that. Is that interesting to you to try to encourage P3s more?
It would definitely interest counties to know that there are these options available. And the more variety, the more tools in our toolbox, the more that we can find programs that will fit and we can implement our infrastructure and transportation needs.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Kyle, you detailed some federal financing options available to states and localities like federal infrastructure banks. Can we talk for a second about the differences between expanding TIFIA, which we use in Ohio and elsewhere, as opposed to creating a new federal infrastructure bank?
Sure. So expanding TIFIA would allow more more state and local governments to borrow money to finance projects that would be partly financed by private money. And state infrastructure banks tend to be capitalized and by either their own money or money from the grants from the federal government, and those then operate like a bank for infrastructure projects.
So could the infrastructure banks pick up some of the gap that's left right now with regard to TIFIA funding? In other words, is it helpful over and above TIFIA funding?
I think we'd have to look at the specifics of a particular proposal to provide more information on that.
Mm-hmm. Beyond TIFIA, what would the economic incentives of creating a national infrastructure bank do with regard to other financing options like tax-exempt bonds, which are used regularly?
So I think different entities would look at the options available to them, recognizing that any loan needs to be repaid with future either tax revenue or user charges.
Senator Portman, we're going to have to move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thanks for the information.
Look forward to working with you. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up a little bit what Senator Portman was. Let me first go to Ms. Shahan, I'm sorry. I'm told that PPPs typically only work if you have an adequate volume of traffic. So, for example, Virginia and Maryland have just had a PPP coming out in which they're going to expand the Beltway, not using a dime of federal taxpayer dollars because the volume is so great on those roadways. But that in the rural areas or the not so rural areas, in Louisiana, there's only one or two places, I'm told, that such a PPP driven by tolls could adequately self-fund. Is that kind of your impression as regards the kind of limitation of a PPP?
While it is unlikely that a rural or smaller scale project will generate adequate revenue to directly pay the debt service associated with public-private partnership financing, that's not always a deterrent in terms of pursuing these options. The state DOTs are looking at their entire program, not just the individual projects. So there's still some opportunities. As an example, the Pennsylvania DOT did embark on a P3 initiative to address numerous structurally deficient bridges across the state. But you're correct, in the majority of cases, you need to have that sustainable source of revenue to pay the debt service on the financing. And so it's used much more heavily for toll road investment and for investment in large.
Let me stop. Dr. Kyle, I don't mean to be rude, I just got limited time. Dr. Kyle, one thing that I've observed that has happened in Australia is that the federal government would put up a pot of money that a local or provincial government, I forget what they have, could get an underwriting of an attempted PPP. With the proviso that any sale of an asset or lease of an asset, that money would go back into infrastructure, setting up a virtuous cycle. Are you familiar with what Australia did?
I've heard of them, but we haven't studied them carefully.
Got you. So in principle, knowing that this would be kind of an intuition, and I don't hold it for you otherwise, that if what we've heard from New Hampshire is that that there is a limit as to the applicability of PPPs on a more rural setting or a less urban setting, I should say. If there was a kind of underwriting by the federal government, that would be a way to address that which we just heard would be a limitation. Fair statement?
So I think anything that draws on private money is going to be drawing on investors who are expecting a return of some sort, and that return ultimately would either come from some sort of user fee or tolls or a future payment.
I guess I accept that, but if you've got a 30% of your overall cost project is financed by something from the federal government, the user fees only have to pick up the remaining 70%, which means that either a lower user fee or a less volume would still be adequate to give the return that the investors expect to have. Does that make sense?
Yes, that sounds right.
Now, let me then ask, what both apparently Australia and China have observed is that once you set up a virtuous cycle in which the proceeds from the lease or sale are obligated to go back into infrastructure, that in turn sets up more infrastructure development, which in turn sets up more tax revenue and more construction activity. Again, a virtuous cycle which builds upon itself. Is it intuitive to you that that would be the case?
So I guess I would come back to any sort of recycling of revenue is obviously coming from either a future government or users. I do take it that increased investment in infrastructure would have generally a positive effect on the economy.
So it'd be more than zero sum. It would actually be something which would, again, be like a souffle rising, if you will. The more economic activity related to infrastructure, if there's pent up demand, would increase economic activity. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yes, and so I do think that we have CUDA has long said that increases investment in infrastructure would tend to increase the capital stock, and that would.
So what can we do to encourage? So I guess final question: what can we do to encourage state and localities to do so-called asset recycling? And maybe I'll ask you, ma'am, Mrs. Buck, what can we do to encourage state and localities for asset recycling? If we can see that it can establish a virtuous cycle in which increased economic activity because of reinvestment of leasing and sales proceeds.
Chair Wyden, Senator Cassidy, I have to say that I'm not fully familiar with the concept that you're working on because at the county level, we don't necessarily work with that program. But I'm happy to work with the National Association of Counties and get back to you.
Okay, Senator Wyden, I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Senator Warner is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to build on my friend Bill Cassidy's souffles in the fact that in Virginia, we have been on the cutting edge or bleeding edge of TIFIA, of P3s, of a whole series of public-private partnerships, and the record is generally good. We've made some mistakes along the way, but we actually have I think a very good record. And it's one of the reasons why, literally for close to 10 years now, starting with Kay Bailey Hutchins and with Lindsey Graham, I've been working on creating a national infrastructure financing authority. It's called the Repair Act. My lead is Senator Blunt. On the Republican side, Senator Cornyn's been a longtime supporter. And what this would set up, because we are the only major industrial nation in the world that doesn't have this kind of national infrastructure financing program. We've got one-off programs like TIFIA or WIFIA, but we don't have a comprehensive approach. The Repair Act, which would only go towards investment-grade projects, an initial appropriation of $10 billion would generate $300 billion in projects. Obviously, as been mentioned, these dollars need to be repaid. But when we're looking at record low interest rates and the ability, particularly with the full faith and credit of the United States, to get 40 or 50-year money, I think we're making a huge mistake not taking advantage of it. And I hope this will be a component part of the president's plan. I know my Republican friends have raised this with the president, and I hope it starts to get some traction. One of the things that I think is important, and I'm going to go to Ms. Sheehan and Commissioner Buck in a moment, is not only the ability to do these projects, but the ability to bring in a central place at the federal level the structuring expertise that candidly TIFIA alone or WIFIA alone or some of these side programs don't have. And I do think if we can bring that expertise that can go toe-to-toe with Wall Street, that can go toe-to-toe with the private sector financiers, the chances of getting the public sector a better deal. I think too many times smaller jurisdictions have turned down this proposal because they just thought it was too complicated. But if we had that centralized expertise, I think this would become available to many more jurisdictions. And matter of fact, our Repair Act has a rural set aside. So, Ms. Sheehan and then Commissioner Buck, could you talk about, particularly for smaller jurisdictions, if we had this centralized expertise along with this long-term capital out there at a market or below market interest rate, how we thought we could, how you might comment on how this could be better used for smaller jurisdictions that right now are bypassing some of these programs.
So Senator
Sheehan,
Warner,
we'll start with
we really
you.
appreciate all of the various financing mechanisms that are available to state DOTs and to the municipalities that we work with. But these programs are complex, and it can be challenging to understand which financing mechanism will be the most advantageous for your particular project. So this is an intriguing idea to have available to both states and localities a resource where they could ensure that they are receiving appropriate guidance on how to most successfully finance their project, reduce the cost of borrowing, and most importantly, increase the value of the investment that's being made. So I think it would be particularly beneficial to municipalities who struggle even more than we do at the state level in terms of getting access to resources to understand the opportunities available to them.
Commissioner Buck.
Chair Wyden, Senator Warren, I find this concept extremely appealing. From a county level, our Public Works Department, who carries out many of these transportation projects, is on a fee-for-service model. And if permits are coming in, we're able to pay for that staffing. If they're not, that staffing isn't there. So the technical expertise portion would be extremely helpful because there's no extra money in our general fund to add staff for these larger projects unless it's built into the project design and pro forma.
Well, I appreciate both of you. I do think we sometimes look at these from a pro forma basis. We don't factor in the expertise that we need to have to assist states, localities. This is complicated stuff. Wall Street brings their first team. We need to have an equal quality team. And Mr. Chairman, I think this is a tool that ought to be used. It can be used for broadband. It can be used for financing electric charging stations for electric vehicles. And my hope is that I know the President expressed some interest that this will be part of a package going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Look forward to working with you. Senator Langford is next.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Kyle, let me ask you a couple of quick questions on some of your testimony. You had mentioned that with general transfers into infrastructure spending or from things that have a fake pay for from general transfer, that has the potential to actually slow our economy when infrastructure construction increases our economy. Adding additional debt, adding just the transfers without pay fors has the potential to slow that. Can you go into greater detail?
So any investment in infrastructure is likely to build the capital stock, and if those are well-selected projects, they would tend to grow the economy as well. As the government takes on more debt to for general revenue or general obligations, that is debt that needs to be serviced in the future. So far, interest rates have been low, and the question is whether and how long that will be the case.
Because that could have the potential then once interest rates continue to climb and the debt continues to climb. So you seem to be affirming having something that's paid for is very important rather than just a general transfer in something that is not paid for or having a pay for that is not legitimate.
Well, so the general transfers obviously are partly funded by debt, and increases in debt need to be serviced.
Right.
So yes.
Mr. Kyle, there's been some questions about electric vehicles, which currently electric vehicles get a tax credit for the purchase of those vehicles, and then they also drive on the roads for free. Now, they're lighter weight vehicles typically, and so they're like other passenger cars as far as the damage they do to the road, but passenger cars do pay a fee to be able to be on the road. Electric vehicles, I think you've quoted about $200 million in income, which is no small amount if they were just to be able to pay their fair share. Now, electric vehicles are dominantly owned by the top 1% wealthiest Americans because they're incredibly expensive vehicles. And one of the perks for being one of those wealthy Americans is also you get to drive the road and not pay a user fee if you buy an electric vehicle. Do you anticipate over the next several years that user fee would grow with the use of electric vehicles, or do you anticipate that $200 million a year that would come in if electric vehicles paid the same as gas vehicles to be able to be on the road? Do you think there's an increasing amount of electric vehicles coming, and so that amount of $200 million would increase.
So I think over time it probably would increase. Right now, electric vehicles account for about 1% of the vehicle fleet and about 2% of sales. And as they grow as a share of the vehicle fleet, any tax or fee applied to them would tend to grow.
What does CBO anticipate as the size of the fleet growing over the next 10 years for electric vehicles?
We'd have to get back to you with specifics on that. It's at the end of 10 years, it still wouldn't, at current growth rates, it wouldn't be a huge share of the vehicle fleet. But we
less than 5% you would anticipate?
That I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you. Ms. Sheehan, let me ask you about other cost factors. Are there regulatory issues that also increase the cost of construction as you're tracking that as well, that we should also address while we're dealing with additional ways to pay for things? Are there ways to also decrease the cost that would have an effect on you?
For many years, Senator Ashto has been advocating for further streamlining of the project development process. It is challenging to navigate all of the federal regulations and to deliver projects in a timely fashion. And so we would welcome any opportunities to continue looking at ways to shorten the design phase of projects so we can get them into construction and make those improvements that communities and stakeholders are eagerly awaiting.
The categorical exclusion issue of allowing states more flexibility with those dollars, is that something helpful to you in the past or something that would be helpful in the future?
It's very helpful to have some flexibility and to allow state DOTs where it's appropriate to take on more direct responsibility so that we have that ownership over the environmental process. It doesn't mean that we're going to circumvent the law in any way, but that we can help expedite things by reviewing documents internally versus having to submit them to federal agency for their consideration.
Thank you. Ms. Bloomfield, let me ask you a quick question about broadband. We have some areas that are very remote, that it's exceptionally expensive to be able to reach some of those areas. Would you encourage the prioritization of some of the highest cost area that they would get satellite connection in those areas, and that we would get fiber and do priority for where we have more folks in a rural area? For instance, we may have a rural community with 50 people in it that we could get fiber to, but then there's the last 3 or 4 people 10 miles out of town that may cost $10 million to get fiber to those. Would you encourage a blending of those to get coverage?
I will be very frank with you. I do think that that there are every tool in the toolbox has to be put on the table when we talk about connecting all Americans. I do think it's really important to think about making the wisest use of federal dollars. I would also say that people jump to the fact that fiber and its cost factor, but actually using fiber is actually cheaper in the long run over many technologies, including those that are going to fuel 5G. I also think with satellite, we've got to really be clear about the capacity satellite will be able to offer, the upfront costs. And even line of sight, you've got some geographic issues. So again, I think that every area has to be viewed, but I do think we should be looking at least to see where we can put that future-proof technology.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Next will be Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses. I'd like to start off first by saying we should not be looking to reverse the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as a way to pay for the infrastructure package. I also don't believe we should be raising the gas tax, as that is disproportionately harmful to rural states like Montana. Personally, I think extending the cap on the state and local tax deduction, which expires at the end of 2025, is something that we should look at, because that raises hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue. It'd be a great pay for, and I hope it's seriously considered as discussions move forward. With that, I'd like to turn briefly to the topic of broadband access. Over the last year, we appropriated billions and billions of dollars for broadband. In rural states like Montana, increasing connectivity is critical, but at this point, it's not necessarily just a money issue. It's an access issue. All the money in the world means nothing if it takes 3 years to get a permit or license to cross federal land. In states like Montana, Arizona, and others, it's nearly impossible to lay down fiber without having to call a federal agency for access. And that's why Senator Kelly and I have introduced the Bipartisan Accelerating Rural Broadband Deployment Act, which will help speed up the process for gaining access to federal right-of-ways to deploy broadband. Question for Mrs. Bloomfield. Your members know better than anyone else how difficult it can be to build out in rural states like Montana. Could you explain why my bipartisan bill needs to be an important component of any broadband infrastructure package?
Absolutely. So you know better than most people, Senator, that high costs are enough of a barrier in deploying broadband in some high-cost state like Montana. But I will share with you, the initiative that you and Senator Kelly, by introducing your Accelerating Rural Broadband Deployment Act, is really critical, because what we have found is that even those who are getting, whether it's they're using universal service funds, whether using the USDA Reconnect funds, we are finding that they are getting tied up in that bureaucratic paper, coordinating different programs, not having shot clocks. It is amazing things like how railroad crossings or crossing federal lands really can tie up deployment. And that is becoming even more critical as we're finding supply chain issues are coming to the forefront, because you may have a carrier out there ready to build. Suddenly their reconnect money is held up by 6 months, 9 months, going through some of these reviews. They're not sure what is happening. And meanwhile, they've lost the window to either build, if you're in a state like Montana, where your build time is a lot shorter than it is in southern states, or you've lost the capacity to get access to some CPE equipment or to fiber. So what you have done with your legislation is really important. We strongly support it, and I think that it's going to really increase transparency in the regulatory process.
Thanks, Mrs. Bloomfield. I want to pivot and talk about speed. There's a lot of talk about speed. Some think 10.1 is too slow, or 25.3 needs to be upgraded. Well, I'll say those. If you're a Montana rancher with 0.0, in other words, no connectivity at all, they've been left behind because federal funding keeps going to upgrade underserved communities instead of connecting those who are completely unserved. Mrs. Bloomfield, do you agree that federal dollars should prioritize connecting the unserved rancher or community before upgrading a suburban home so they can stream 3 Netflix movies at the same time instead of just 2?
So I'd like to think they're doing more productive things than streaming. Maybe somebody's working on a VPN, but I will say absolutely. We've got some work to do to connect all Americans. And I think for new construction, using federal support, we absolutely should be using the mapping that the FCC is coming down with now consistently across all states to find those unconnected and make those the top priority. And then we can look to make sure that we continue to upgrade and sustain the networks going forward.
Ms. Bloomfield, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thank you as well.
Thank you, Senator Dane. Senator Hassens next.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Crapo, again for having this hearing. And good afternoon, Commissioner Sheehan. It's really nice to see you. I do want to ask you a question. You talk about the importance of a long-term reauthorization of federal surface transportation programs for infrastructure projects in New Hampshire. Short-term extensions could disrupt these projects and impact our workforce, our economy, and our road safety. So can you give us examples, Commissioner, of projects in New Hampshire that would be disrupted by a short-term extension of surface transportation programs, and how a short extension would impact New Hampshire's economy?
Well, thank you, Senator, and it's great to see you as well this morning. Any interruption in the federal surface transportation program would have devastating consequences, especially in a cold weather state like New Hampshire with a relatively short construction season. The inability to advertise projects in the fall and winter could mean that we would lose the majority of an entire construction season. And so even short-term extensions could have longer-term impacts. We have projects of all types and sizes that we would plan to advance, from important resiliency work like scour mitigation on some of our critical bridges, to investments in intersection safety improvements, guardrail upgrades. And then there's numerous projects that are tremendously important to communities. We have a lot of transportation alternative funding that is anticipated to be utilized with projects being advertised in the first quarter of the next federal fiscal year. So we really want to be able to deliver on those commitments, which is why a timely reauthorization is so important.
Well, thanks so much. And again, thank you for your leadership and for the work you do. And I look forward to seeing you back home in person soon. I want to move to a question for Ms. Bloomfield. Ms. Bloomfield, broadband is a necessity for families and small businesses in the 21st century, and you've surely been making that point this morning. Today, I reintroduced the Broadband Financing Flexibility Act, a bipartisan bill with Senator Capito that would expand tax-advantaged financing tools for rural broadband projects. Our bill would make it easier for state and local governments to work with private partners and finance high-speed rural broadband projects with tax-exempt bonds. How would these kinds of financing tools encourage private sector deployment of high-speed broadband to rural areas?
I congratulate you on your initiative. I think it's really, I think it's an exciting initiative. I think that we have not seen a lot of our community-based providers utilizing bonds, but I think that if there's the ability for private providers, again, community-based providers, to be able to access some of these bond funds, I think that could be, again, another piece of figuring out ways to actually make what is a tough business model actually a go, particularly because we're seeing in some areas a lot of partnerships where local municipalities and governments are reaching out to our community-based providers to say, we've got a broadband void. How can we work together to actually build a network? Letting the municipality, potentially handle some of the financing and work with the bonds, and letting the broadband provider actually provide the broadband. So I think that your initiative to focus on communities that need broadband access is really critical. The fact that you are looking to use funding for future-proof networks is really another positive. And I think the bonds themselves will help upfront with upfront deployment. I think the next question then becomes, how do you sustain it after you've built it? But we can cross that bridge after we get some of these networks built. So again, we commend you for your leadership.
Well, thank you for that. I have one more question for you, which focuses on, again, rural broadband. The year-end relief package contained my bipartisan bill with Senator Grassley to extend the deadline for state and local governments to use relief funds for broadband and other infrastructure projects. Through the American Rescue Plan, states and localities will soon have access to additional assistance that can be used for rural broadband projects. Ms. Bloomfield, how have the state and local relief funds to date helped expand rural broadband connectivity? And what lessons from the past year can we apply to supporting rural broadband connectivity going forward?
Well, first of all, I have to thank you for extending, because when the CARES Act went through, everybody was very excited to see this additional funding coming out that they could use on the state level. And so many states did agree to allow the CARES Act funding to be used for broadband, but suddenly that clock was ticking. Yeah. And, if you weren't in line for fiber, you weren't in line for some of the equipment, that deadline just became a barrier. So extending it became very helpful. What I think some of those initiatives have done have really prompted states who did not have state broadband programs to now create their own programs. So that partnership, I think, is really going to be important, having the federal programs that exist, partnering with the state programs who probably in a lot of ways know best where those gaps are within the state. That is the way we're really going to bridge this digital divide.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for your good work on broadband, Senator Hassan. As Ms. Bloomfield knows, we put a lot of work into trying to get that $50 a month subsidy, and we're seeing people step forward. And the point is, in this country, we've got to get to the point where broadband is like electricity was years ago, where we said everybody's got to have it. And we're really glad that Senator Hassan is leading our committee on that. Next is Senator Barrasso.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Infrastructure is important to every state. It's important to every community. It's important to every tribe in the country. America's roads and bridges, highways, tunnels support the nation's economic growth and our competitiveness. Our economy is built on a well-functioning road system that allows products from rural areas to get transported to our population centers. They used to ship American-made products and goods from one coast to the other. Interstates like I-80 in my home state of Wyoming, critical arteries for commerce in the country. Our roads create jobs. They move products. They keep our country running and going strong. Roads and bridges have to keep pace. The systems are vital to our country, and they need to be taken care of. We need to maintain and upgrade, and where necessary, build new ones. Now, the Highway Trust Fund is funded through users' fees. Those who use the roads pay for their upkeep. The most famous example, of course, is the gas tax, which represented over 25% of the Highway Trust Fund tax receipts in 2019. Number of users of our roads, bridges, and highways that don't pay anything for their upkeep. And right now, electric vehicles don't pay a cent to maintain America's roads. These vehicles don't contribute because they don't buy gasoline. Gas, electric, alternative fuel vehicles all use the same roads. They put the same amount of wear and tear on those roads. Every driver really should contribute to maintain our highways. My priority is to make sure these vehicles are contributing to the maintenance of the roads, especially as their use continues to increase from year to year. And you've seen the predictions that by the end of this decade, 8% of vehicles will be electric vehicles on the roads, but by 2040, over 30% of the vehicles on the roads will be electric vehicles. So with a rapidly growing electric vehicle market, it's necessary to make sure that drivers of these alternative fuel vehicles are contributing to road maintenance. An electric vehicle does as much damage to the highway as a traditional gas-powered vehicle that has the same number of axles and weighs the same. Everyone who drives on the road should contribute to the cost of the maintenance. That's why I plan to introduce legislation to ensure all users of our roads, bridges, and highways contribute to the upkeep. So I have a question for the Congressional Budget Office for Mr. Klein, and I appreciate your response to Senator Langford regarding EV users fee. I agree with him that 200 million is a substantial amount, especially in rural America. I'd like to shift to getting your thoughts on the electric vehicle tax credit. The Joint Committee on Taxation has said that this credit disproportionately subsidizes higher income earners. Rather than subsidizing the wealthy, these funds might better be utilized by investing in roads and bridges and highways. Can you speak to the possible revenue saved by repealing this federal tax credit for purchasing electric vehicles?
So, Senator, we'd be happy to get back to you on that, or work with our colleagues in the Joint Committee to come up with an estimate of that. I don't have a number on that for you at the moment.
So as far as funding our highways, couldn't Congress direct these savings and future savings to fixing our roads and bridges and highways?
Congress could do that, yes.
Thank you. The chairman has released a tax bill that would extend the electric vehicle tax credit until electrical vehicles represent over 50% of vehicle sales. This extension could, I believe, cost lots of money that could be used for actual infrastructure spending instead of subsidizing vehicles for the wealthy. Can you speak to the additional cost of such massive extension of this tax credit to the point of when electric vehicles represent over 50% of vehicle sales?
Again, Senator, we would be happy to work with our colleagues on the Joint Committee on that, but I don't have an estimate of that.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Barrasso. Next will be Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the panelists. It's a great conversation. Let me jump in on the broadband conversation. I'm from Nevada. We definitely have underserved communities in our urban and rural areas, and I want to thank so many of you for really the good work that you're doing to make sure we are bringing service to these communities. Ms. Bloomfield, let me start with you. We've been talking about the need for a strong oversight role to ensure that we're properly investing billions in broadband access, as well as sufficient coordination across all of our federal agencies. And I could not agree more. That's why I worked to pass the Bipartisan Access Broadband Act in the year-end package last year. Can I get your support for the proper and sufficient implementation of this legislation to ensure that not only do we have an easier federal broadband funding system for our providers and communities, but that we also track each dollar to ensure its efficient use?
Senator, you were like a visionary when you had that passed. Little did you know all of these programs would be coming down. So I would say that what you put together in your legislative package, talking about streamlining these federal broadband programs, of which there are many, and improving the federal agency coordination are really both very key efforts. So I would share with you that we look forward to helping work with you, work with Congress, work with NTIA, anything that is needed to make sure that all of these current, existing, upcoming new programs on broadband stay coordinated. Again, we're seeing things happening on the states, on the federal level, all across these different agencies, and ensuring that there's real operational coordination, I think is really going to be smartest use of federal funding. So again, absolutely, we support your efforts, and we are here to get this up and running and to make it successful.
And thank you. And thank you again for your partnership as we've worked together, particularly in the state of Nevada, to really bring broadband into our communities. And I have to thank NACO and the League of Cities. They've been at the forefront informing me on this legislation based on the needs in our communities. And let me just finally say to my colleagues, in the 2018 Farm Bill, we were able to pass a bipartisan provision to really stand up an effective, innovative rural council that leverages beneficial investments across all of our multiple departments. And that is intended to work through the permitting challenges that we are talking about today. So I am hopeful that that gets set up and we continue to work together. So thank you. Thank you so much. Commissioner Buck, thank you for being here. I am partial to our cities and counties because I worked as an assistant county manager in Clark County for a number of years, and my father was a county commissioner. And so I always believe that you guys are on the forefront. We should make it flexible for you to utilize these dollars. You know better than anyone what's needed in your communities. Let me ask you this. I have I have introduced a bipartisan bill called the Moving First Act to create a Smart Communities Grant Challenge at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Listen, it is an exciting time for us. We are going into an innovation economy that includes taking this new technology that's going to improve our communities, our transportation. As one of my colleagues in Nevada has said, this technology is the new asphalt for the future. And so can you speak to what you're seeing at the local level and why you support expanding the transportation and technology partnerships that we're seeing become more popular across the country?
Chair Wyden, Senator Cortez Masto, thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done on that bill. Counties and NACO support the bipartisan legislation of the Moving First Act. Counties support transportation technologies that will help us meet the transportation demands of the future and improve safety and efficiency of our local roads. Counties support federal incentives to promote nationwide energy conservation efforts, including tax incentives, rebates, and promotions that will promote the purchase of low and no emission vehicles by both the public and the private sector.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation. And thank you to the chairman again and to the ranking member. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Next will be Senator Warren. If she is, there she is. Good.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored how crucial infrastructure is to making our economy and our communities work. And that includes the roads and buses that Americans take to work or to school. But it also includes the childcare that allows parents to go to work and the high-speed internet that allows our kids to rely on for their studies. And yet our investments in all of that vital infrastructure have been both inadequate and inequitable. So take our roads, which are earned a D on the most recent infrastructure report card from the American Society for Civil Engineers. 1 out of every 5 miles of American highways and roads is in poor condition. So we're failing to adequately fund basic road maintenance and repairs, much less invest in transit modernization and electrification. It holds back our economy. This contributes to climate crisis. It harms public health, especially in minority communities. Ms. Sheehan, you have worked for over a decade on public transit, including bridges and highways in Massachusetts. So let me ask you, would large-scale investments in transit electrification help communities across the country?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator, and the answer is yes. Transit agencies and DOTs are embracing electrification. I believe at this point, transit agencies in over 40 states have chosen to pursue electric bus purchases despite the higher initial purchase prices, because the benefits justify that additional investment with significant cost savings in terms of operations because of the increased fuel efficiency. So it's about a 78% lower lifetime fuel cost compared to traditional vehicles. But most importantly, these vehicles are quieter, and there's 100% reduction in tailpipe emissions, which improves quality of life for everyone who lives adjacent to public transit routes. And that's
Okay.
why states are continuing to pursue these investments.
So thank you. That's very helpful, Ms. Sheehan. Here we are falling behind on these investments. We need to go big to combat climate change and to grow our economy. Now, President Biden has proposed investing $174 billion in vehicle electrification, which is a good start. The Build Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act that I introduced with Senator Markey and Representatives Levin and Ocasio-Cortez would invest $500 billion over 10 years to help us get to all electric public vehicles and rail. My forthcoming Buy Green Act with Congressman Levin will establish a further $1.5 trillion in federal procurement to purchase American-made clean energy products for federal, state, and local use and for export. Ms. Buck, let me ask you, you worked with local governments all across the country. Can we rely on local government to generate the revenue needed to make these big investments in transit modernization and electrification? Or does the federal government need to step up if we're going to make this happen?
Chair Wyden, Senator Warren, while we are doing our part on the local level, counties are limited in a variety of ways from raising any local revenue. We rely on the strength of the intergovernmental partnership to deliver this critical infrastructure projects that our residents need and expect. Counties urge Congress to direct funds to locally owned infrastructure that will allow us to better meet the needs of our community.
Good. Thank you. I agree with you on this. President Biden has proposed raising taxes on the wealthy and on giant corporations to pay for these vital investments in our nation's infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Republicans have proposed imposing user fees and fuel taxes rather than raise taxes on the wealthy and on big corporations. So, Dr. Kyle, let me ask you a question around this. Let's assume that a school teacher making the average teaching salary in Massachusetts and a CEO making millions of dollars a year both have the same distance to drive as their commute to work, and they use the same number of gallons of gas a year. Which one of them pays more as a share of their income when we pay for infrastructure investments by imposing a gasoline tax?
So, Senator, gasoline taxes tend to be regressive in that they impose a larger burden on, in terms of share of income that goes to pay for those taxes on people in the lower and middle income quintiles than they do on the upper income quintiles.
You just said in a fancier way. So the school teacher pays more as a share of his or her income than the wealthy person does if you use these user fees. I hope I got that right. Is that right, Dr. Kyle?
Yes, in the scenario you had, that was correct.
Good. You know, it is absurd to suggest that we should finance this investment on the backs of school teachers and firefighters and small business owners. President Biden and I have both put forward full menus of options for paying for these long overdue investments in our shared infrastructure. Options that are not going to hurt the very people who are struggling the most to recover from this pandemic. My wealth tax, real corporate profits tax, tax enforcement plan, those three things would raise $6 trillion without raising taxes on 99.9% of Americans by a single penny. And that's enough to pay for every penny of President Biden's American Jobs Plan, to pay for every single penny of his American Families Plan, and to still have $2 trillion left over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Cantwell, with significant responsibilities in transportation as the chair of the Commerce Committee. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for this important hearing. I just want to clarify before I get to those transportation issues. You, Mr. Chairman, and I, my colleagues, Senator Young and Senator Portman, have introduced increasing the low-income housing tax credit. All our states face incredible shortages in the lack of affordable housing. So continuing to push the tax credit increase to 50% over the next 2 years could help us deal with this crisis. We're not really avoiding it. We're still having to deal with a population without housing options, and thereby causing increased cost in healthcare and a whole variety of issues. So We've introduced legislation, and so I wanted to ask the witnesses, Ms. Bush particularly, do you consider a housing tax credit part of critical infrastructure that we need to build in the country? And would you support the funding of affordable housing tax credit increases?
Chair Wyden, Senator Cantwell, thank you so much for the question. We appreciate your work, excuse me, to increase the supply of affordable housing and utilization of the low-income tax credit. Counties support reducing the private activity bond threshold from 50 to 25%. And what I would like to add to that is that we need to concurrently be able to increase the capacity of our project developers to be able to fulfill the actual projects that pipeline will fill. As a former project developer for an affordable housing provider myself, I can tell you that there is not a streamlined educational tool to train project developers. And so they usually come in very green into an organization and the pipeline is very thin.
So, well, but we do have a backlog right now, right? I mean, we have more projects that are on the books than we can fund, correct?
The projects are available. The people that are qualified as project developers and managers to actually fulfill the work is where the pipeline squeezes.
Okay.
And they need the extra training and the incentives to build that particular industry base to fulfill those projects.
Okay. So what are you thinking there as an incentive on that? I mean, listen, I get it. If you're talking about Seattle and you're trying to get, or, you know, the whole region, Puget Sound, and you're trying to get somebody to work on those projects, there's enough construction work. Yes, it's going to be challenging to get somebody to work on affordable housing.
Project developers were more of a liaison between the provider that's actually wanting to develop the work and the construction workers doing the work. These project developers come up with the pro formas, the concept, write the grants, everything that's needed inside the organization to actually put the project forward. That's the area where I find the most constraint in order to fulfill the affordable housing needs.
Well, I love what our, you know, there's people all over, you know, Puget Sound trying to figure out what to do about affordable housing. I know the same could be probably said in Oregon and Portland area, but we're not going to get out of this without the federal tax incentive being increased. The majority of affordable housing projects that get built with a tax credit. So if we're not increasing the available credit, no region is going to be able to successfully get out of this predicament that we're in. And I definitely think it's an issue of us not meeting demand. We have just, for a bunch of different economic and demographic regions, had far more people falling into this category of needing this kind of housing. And we just need to meet the demand. I think we're spending a lot of time discussing, well, how did we get here? And in reality, we just have to meet demand. So I hope that our colleagues will consider this, and it obviously is stimulative. I want to turn to Ms. Shaheen, or actually you, Commissioner Bush. I think people think that on transportation that we actually, people have been talking about various things, including user fees. But we really just don't have a sustainable source for the future. Is that not correct with where we are on the Highway Trust Fund? I don't know how much this has come up, Mr. Chairman, already, but I'm just trying to get to the point of we obviously want to build back better, but the larger issue facing us is we don't have a sustainable fund for the future.
Chair Wyden, Senator Cantwell, I'll take that. As we mentioned in earlier testimony, counties are very concerned about the looming insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund. We encourage our federal partners to do as much as they can to find a sustainable way to continue to fund that particular method that we as counties rely on in order to fulfill all of the transportation needs for our community.
So any other witness want to take that on, Ms. Shaheen, or?
Senator, I'd be happy to respond. Yes, we at AASHTO acknowledge that we have a significant shortfall to overcome. And that is why we're willing to support this committee and Congress as you evaluate long-term sustainable solutions. It's been mentioned a couple of times today, but any shortfall or delay in federal funding leads to serious cash flow problems for states and local governments. And most importantly, we fail to deliver on the projects and the commitments that we're making as part of our public engagement processes. These are extremely important transportation investments that impact quality of life, provide economic opportunity. We need to find a sustainable way to pay for them.
Yeah, well, I've personally, in a bipartisan way, suggested cap and dividend in the past, just because the dividend can keep consumers whole while you're making these investments and helps you and mitigate impact along the way. It's picked up support from, business roundtables and chambers of commerce and, various organizations. But I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we will focus on this this larger issue, because we are on an unsustainable path. For us in the Northwest, we, see the incredible growth that's still there as a potential, even post-pandemic for us. We're seeing congestion at our ports, on our highways. We need to make these investments to stay competitive. And so I hope that we will look not just at this very near term, but this unsustainability that we have, because the Highway Trust Fund will be, as the witnesses said, reach a level of insolvency. So it's time to put us on a good stead for the future. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, and particularly for highlighting the importance of housing, both for our region and the country. Our final senator is our partner in this, Todd Young. So these are bipartisan issues. And not only is Senator Cantwell right about LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit, I propose something called MITEC, the middle-income housing tax credit, because I'm not convinced on our current path that somebody who's a firefighter and somebody who's a nurse are going to have an opportunity to be part of the American dream. So put me down as being in favor of Senator Cantwell and Senator Young, and Senator Young will be our final questioner.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you for highlighting the importance of housing affordability, and I thank Senator Cantwell for her longtime leadership in this area. It's a privilege to work with her. Senator Cantwell also addressed briefly the issue of private activity bonds, which can serve an important role in financing public projects. In fact, for infrastructure mega projects over the last 15 years, $12 billion in private activity bonds led to $45 billion in project activity. So we're looking at almost a 4x return there. But under current law, our nation's public buildings can't qualify for tax-exempt private activity bonds when employing public-private partnerships. Now, there are certainly projects beyond those that currently qualify for private activity bond financing, which is why I recently reintroduced my Public Buildings Renewal Act with Senator Cortez Masto. I'm curious, however, how we can further leverage private financing to fund public projects. Ms. Sheehan, are there opportunities to expand the use of private activity bonds in the transportation space? And do you believe that it is a worthwhile financing mechanism for us to explore?
So thank you for that question. And yes, state DOTs would be interested in extending any of the current financing mechanisms that are available to us. As I've said in my earlier testimony, we're really trying to, as you described it, stretch the value of the investments that we're making, and being able to partner with the private sector to ensure that we can invest at a greater level and beyond what's available with the revenues being provided is extremely important, so that we can advance projects sooner and hedge against inflation when there is a strong economic climate for borrowing.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sheehan. I asked that because I'm looking for some more creativity as we try and identify ways to either pay for or finance
our infrastructure investments. What we've seen from the Biden administration's proposals are what we frankly might expect from a Democratic president. Expensive tax and spend proposals. Instead of shackling our free enterprise system with harmful tax hikes as we emerge from a global pandemic, I believe, and I think most of the Hoosiers I represent believe, that we really need to explore creative proposals that are already out there to leverage private sector dollars. We should do that before we turn to increasing taxes as we emerge from this pandemic. Ms. Sheehan, just as a follow-up, what are some public-private partnership proposals you support or think would be useful in improving and developing our transportation infrastructure?
So state DOTs look at our entire program and all of the projects, in particular those large-scale projects, and try to determine what the most cost-effective funding and financing solution might be. And so certainly where public-private partnerships are concerned, we are trying to identify projects that both have a sustainable source of revenue to be able to pay the debt service and support the financing, as well as we need that reliable source of federal funding into the future so that we can embark in P3 projects where we use availability payments and are committing our future state and federal revenues from traditional sources to pay that debt service. But it's all about delivering the project sooner. And so we want to make sure that every financing option is available to us. We have as many tools in the toolkit as possible, because it's about providing that value to the citizens by advancing the projects to benefit communities and provide economic opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Sheehan. I'll give Dr. Kyle an opportunity to answer the same question. Dr. Kyle, what do you support in the public-private partnership space as it relates to transportation infrastructure?
Well, of course, CBO doesn't have a particular policy that we support or oppose. We just assess options for you. As far as
could you assess some options for me, sir?
Sure. As far as public-private partnerships go, or any of the financing mechanisms, they do allow an opportunity for federal money to be used to couple with money from the private sector. That money for the private sector is only coming with the expectation of a return at some point, either by revenue from users of whatever system is being financed, or by future payments from a government.
Okay, so why don't we focus on the prior category as opposed to the latter category? Could you offer some more specificity to some of those options that would yield revenue, which would be used in turn to pay the investors over a number of years?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure. You said the prior category. I'm not sure what that was.
You seem to break down public-private partnerships into crowding in private investment on the belief that either user fees of some sort, right, would pay back the investors, or the government itself would pay it back through taxation, presumably, right? So, or it could be bonding, but ultimately, that would cost taxpayers. So, if you could offer me some examples of the first area where the revenue alone, you've seen through real life examples, pays back the private investors.
So there are a bunch of projects, many of them tend to be toll roads, that collect revenues from users, tolls, and that contribute to part of the funding of the project. We'd have to get back to you with the specifics of how that funding breaks down by project.
Okay. Well, there's much more to discuss here, but I'm already over time. The chairman's been quite generous. So thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague. And we began almost 3 hours ago with a real dose of strong bipartisanship. I see our friend, the ranking member, Senator Crapo here. Both of us made it clear we want to involve the private sector more extensively in terms of infrastructure funding. That's what Build America bonds are all about. And I note that 5 members of the United States Senate today were co-sponsors of our original effort, which in the space of a year and a half sold $183 billion worth of Build America bonds. So the point that my colleagues, most recently in the last few minutes, Senator Young, have mentioned about a role for the private sector has already been proven. So we're going to pursue that in all options. Just a couple of final comments, and then I always want Senator Crapo to have a chance to talk as well. The principle of fairness must be front and center in this whole effort with respect to paying for roads. And just yesterday, and I'm going to put this, colleagues, into the record, the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. companies have authorized $504 billion of share repurchases. That's stock buybacks, which is the most during this period in at least 22 years. So what we're going to be explaining to citizens as working people are trying to figure out how to come out of the pandemic, the Wall Street Journal is telling us we're having a record mega corporation spree in terms of stock buybacks. So we've got to find a way to embed deeply the principle of fairness, because we're all making the point that we've got to come up with solutions that are fair, and that means everybody is going to have to be part of that solution. One last point, and that is the Finance Committee has some history here, and too often opportunities have been missed. For example, 4 years ago, the committee had significant bipartisan agreement that a portion of the hundreds of billions of dollars in repatriated funds from multinational companies as part of the tax bill would go to fund infrastructure. And we had debates about what percentage it ought to be, but there was a clear bipartisan consensus, and the Trump administration didn't want to have any part of that. So I want to invite my colleague from Idaho to say anything should he choose to do so, but I think this has been a good session. We want to thank our guests. The testimony was very good. It really stuck to the facts and the record, and I intend to work very closely with Senator Crapo in a bipartisan way. We cannot miss this moment. Too many Americans are depending on our coming forward on infrastructure because, as we said 3 hours ago, you can't have big league economic growth with little league infrastructure. Senator Crapo, would you like to add anything else?
Yes, just briefly, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and for the bipartisan effort that you want to work with us on. There is no disagreement. There's no bipartisan disagreement about the need for a strong, robust effort to strengthen our infrastructure in the United States. And thank you to our witnesses. You have discussed very eloquently and effectively a number of the different specific and types of options that we have to look at as we try to find ways to get capital committed to infrastructure in the United States, whether that is through direct spending from the federal treasury, whether that is through our tax policy, whether that is through the public-private partnerships or the other ways that we have discussed today to incentivize private capital to flow into infrastructure spending and build out the infrastructure across this nation. Once again, I thank all of you for participating and for your input from your expertise as to how this works and how Congress can most effectively accomplish this goal. And Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you again.
With that, the Finance Committee wants to thank our guests. 1 week from today, questions for the record are due from senators. And with that, the Senate Finance Committee thanks you all, and we're adjourned.